The origins of the Imperial Penal Legions can be traced back to the tumultuous age of strife, when humanity's interstellar empire collapsed amid warp storms and alien predation. Long before the Imperium's formal establishment, the desperate remnants of human civilization had already begun to employ their criminals and malcontents as expendable soldiers. On Terra itself, the techno-barbarian warlords who ruled the fragmented planet frequently used captives and dissidents as cannon fodder, sending waves of condemned troops against enemy strongholds to exhaust ammunition and test defenses. When the Emperor began the Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium, he incorporated these pragmatic and brutal practices into the expanding Imperium's military doctrine. The early penal legions were formed not from a desire for redemption or justice, but from cold military necessity. Every human life could serve the Emperor's purpose, willingly or otherwise. The first formalized penal units were established shortly after the Thunder Warriors were retired and the early Astartes legions began to take shape. While the Emperor's genetically enhanced warriors formed the speartip of his conquests, the expanding war machine required bodies to hold ground, garrison worlds, and conduct operations where deploying Astartes would be wasteful. Those early penal formations bore little resemblance to their modern counterparts. Discipline was enforced through crude explosive collars or neural implants, rather than the sophisticated explosive harnesses used in the 41st millennium. Records from this period remain fragmentary, but surviving accounts describe how commanders would sometimes use entire penal battalions as living mine clearance units, marching them across suspected minefields before regular troops advanced. The legal framework governing sentencing to penal legions evolved considerably during the Great Crusade. Initially, assignment to penal service was arbitrary and often politically motivated. As the Imperium expanded and established formal governance over its territories, the process became more codified. The precursors to the Adeptus Arbites, then simply known as Imperial Enforcers, began to standardize the sentencing protocols. By the middle years of the Great Crusade, a recognizable legal structure had emerged. Lesser crimes might merit service in auxiliary labor battalions, while more serious offenses resulted in assignment to frontline penal units. The most heinous criminals, traitors, mass murderers, and those who committed crimes against the imperial truth were consigned to the redemption companies, suicide units deployed against the most dangerous objectives. The Adeptus Arbites, formalized after the Horus Heresy, became the primary imperial authority responsible for sentencing criminals to penal legion service. Their judge officers possessed the authority to condemn individuals directly, bypassing local planetary justice systems entirely when imperial law is violated. This power extends across all strata of imperial society, though in practice, the wealthy and politically connected often find ways to avoid such sentences. The Arbites maintain vast detention facilities on most major imperial worlds, where the condemned await transfer to penal legion processing centers. These holding prisons, known colloquially as legion pits, are notorious for their harsh conditions. Prisoners receive minimal sustenance and medical care, just enough to ensure they arrive at their destination alive and capable of basic military function. The sentencing guidelines used by Arbites judges have remained remarkably consistent for millennia. Standard sentences range from 5 to 20 years of penal service, though in practice, few survive more than their first few deployments. Certain crimes carry automatic life sentences, including desertion from Imperial Guard service, theft of Imperial military property, and heretical speech against the Emperor. A specialized branch of the Arbites, the Detentional Corps, handles the logistics of transferring prisoners to Adeptus Munitorum custody. These grim-faced officers, distinguished by their black and brass uniforms rather than the standard Arbites blue, oversee the transport ships that carry the condemned to penal legion mustering stations. The largest of these transports, the ancient judgment-class prison barges, can carry up to 50,000 prisoners in stasis cells. Once sentenced, prisoners effectively cease to exist in imperial records as individuals. Their names are expunged, replaced with alphanumeric designations. Their property is forfeit to the Imperium, their families receive no compensation or notification of their fate, and any titles or positions they held are declared vacant. This complete erasure of identity serves both practical and psychological purposes. It severs the prisoner's connections to their past life and reinforces that their only path forward lies in service and potential redemption. The Adeptus Munitorum, the vast logistical apparatus of the imperial military, assumes control of penal legionnaires upon their arrival at processing centers. These facilities, often located on harsh frontier worlds or barren moons, are where the condemned are transformed from prisoners into penal troops. The process is brutal and efficient. New arrivals are stripped, deloused, implanted with explosive discipline collars or harnesses, and subjected to hypno-indoctrination to instill basic combat reflexes and unquestioning obedience. Within the Adeptus Munitorum's labyrinthine organizational structure, penal legions fall under the authority of the Officio Praefectus, the same administrative body that oversees the commissariat. This arrangement is no coincidence. Both institutions exist to ensure discipline and compliance, albeit through different methods. While commissars maintain morale and loyalty in regular guard units, the Officio Praefectus Penitentiary uses more direct measures with penal legionnaires. The administrative designation of penal formations varies widely across the Imperium. Some are organized as penitent battalions, attached to standard guard regiments, while others form independent redemption legions, numbering tens of thousands of troops. The largest, the infamous Legion of the Damned, not to be confused with the spectral Space Marine formation of the same name, reportedly fields over 1 million penitent soldiers across multiple war zones, though it exists more as a designation for administrative purposes than as a unified fighting force. Penal legions occupy an unusual position within the Astra Militarum hierarchy. They are not considered true guard units, lacking the honor and status of even the most poorly regarded regular regiments. Yet they remain under overall guard command structure, typically answering to Lord Generals who view them as disposable assets. Penal units are rarely included in strategic planning sessions or given detailed mission briefings. Their commanders receive simplified objectives, often amounting to little more than attack coordinates and expected casualty rates. The officers who command penal legions fall into 3 categories. The lowest level, squad trustees, are typically penal legionnaires themselves who have demonstrated sufficient loyalty or survival instinct to be granted limited authority over their fellows. Above them are the discipline masters, usually former guard non-commissioned officers who have committed minor infractions but possess valuable experience. At the highest level are the legion marshals, often disgraced guard officers seeking redemption or ambitious schola progenium, graduates assigned to penal command as a test of their leadership abilities. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains separate supply chains for penal legions, reflecting their expendable nature. Their equipment is typically outdated or substandard, lasguns that have failed quality control tests, flak armor rejected from regular guard shipments, and rations near expiration. Some penal units receive specialized equipment based on their mission profiles, such as the demolition charges issued to bomber squads or the flame units provided to purification teams, but these are exceptions rather than standard issue. One of the most distinctive aspects of penal legion service is the theological dimension of redemption through sacrifice. The Adeptus Ministorum, the imperial state church, has incorporated penal service into its broader doctrines of atonement and salvation. According to Ministorum teachings, the blood shed by penal legionnaires in the emperor's service cleanses their souls of sin, offering a path to redemption that would otherwise be denied to them. This theological framework developed gradually over millennia. During the Great Crusade, when the imperial truth suppressed religious expression, penal service was viewed in purely practical terms. Following the emperor's internment in the Golden Throne and the rise of the imperial cult, Ministorum preachers began to reinterpret penal legion service as a form of penance. By the 32nd millennium, this concept had been formalized in the doctrine of redemptive sacrifice, which remains influential in imperial theology. Ministorum priests assigned to penal legions, known as redemptors, combine the roles of spiritual advisor and psychological enforcer. These clerics preach constantly to their charges, emphasizing that each battlefield death brings the legionnaire closer to the Emperor's forgiveness. The most zealous redemptors lead from the front, carrying massive redemption staffs, topped with imperial aquilas that serve as both religious symbols and brutal melee weapons. The theological aspects of penal service are reinforced through various rituals. Before deployment, legionnaires undergo absolution ceremonies, where they confess their crimes and receive conditional forgiveness contingent upon their battlefield performance. Those who survive multiple deployments may receive markers of atonement, small aquila brands that indicate partial redemption of their spiritual debt. In rare cases, legionnaires who display exceptional valor may be granted full redemption, allowing them to transfer to regular guard units, though they remain under special observation for the remainder of their service. The Ministerum's involvement serves multiple practical purposes beyond spiritual guidance. The promise of redemption provides motivation for otherwise desperate troops, while the constant religious indoctrination helps prevent the development of resentment or rebellion among the condemned. Moreover, the theological framework justifies the harsh treatment of penal legionnaires to the wider imperial population, presenting their sacrifice as an opportunity rather than a punishment. The journey from condemned criminal to penal legionnaire begins in the shadowed cells of imperial justice. Across the million worlds of the Imperium, sentencing practices vary dramatically, shaped by local customs, planetary governance, and the temperament of individual judges. On Mordian, where rigid social order defines existence, even minor infractions against imperial productivity quotas can result in penal legion assignment. Contrast this with the feral world of Dusk, where only the most heinous tribal taboo violations, typically involving blasphemy against the god emperor, merit such punishment. Hive worlds typically produce the highest number of penal legion recruits, their overcrowded underhives breeding grounds for the desperate and lawless. In the packed spires of Necromunda, RBTs conduct regular purges, rounding up thousands of underhive gangers and processing them en masse through abbreviated tribunal procedures. A Necromunda ganger might face a 20-year penal legion sentence for the same crime that would earn a mid-hive worker a 5-year term or a spire noble a mere fine. Frontier worlds and newly compliant planets operate under different sentencing guidelines. The Administratum grants frontier governors broader discretion in filling penal legion quotas, recognizing the challenges of establishing imperial rule on untamed worlds. On Cathar, a recently integrated agri-world in the Segmentum Pacificus, the planetary governor has implemented a tithe-by-crime system, where annual shortfalls in agricultural production are offset by increasing penal legion sentences for minor infractions. Forge worlds under Adeptus Mechanicus control maintain their own justice systems, typically condemning those who damage valuable machinery or disrupt production to penal legion service. The Mechanicus views this as doubly efficient, removing problematic elements from their workforce while providing bodies for the Imperium's wars. Tech priests on Mars have developed particularly sophisticated methods for identifying potential troublemakers before they commit crimes, using cognitive pattern analysis to flag workers for preemptive penal legion assignment. The actual arrest and processing of future legionnaires follows strict protocols established over millennia. Local enforcers or RBT's officers secure the condemned with magnicles, magnetized restraints that can be remotely tightened if resistance is detected. The prisoners are then transported to central holding facilities, where they undergo preliminary assessment. Medical servitors scan for communicable diseases, while administratum scribes record biometric data and criminal histories. Those with specialized skills or technical knowledge are flagged for potential assignment to specialized penal units, such as the engineer penitent battalions that support imperial siege operations. Transport to Adeptus Munitorum processing centers represents the condemned's first taste of the brutal efficiency that will define their new existence. The massive prison barges, some dating back to the Great Crusade, operate on minimal life support settings. Prisoners are typically kept in stasis during warp transit, packed into cramped suspension chambers by the thousands. Those who cannot be accommodated in stasis cells due to equipment limitations or physiological incompatibility endure the journey conscious, confined to overcrowded holding pens where mortality rates can reach 15% on longer voyages. Upon arrival at processing centers, the transformation from prisoner to penal legionnaire begins in earnest. The initial procedure, known as stripping, involves the complete removal of the individual's previous identity. Prisoners are shaved bald, their clothing and any personal effects confiscated. Tattoos or other identifying marks are either removed or obscured with chemical burns. Even their names cease to exist, replaced by alphanumeric designations based on their processing batch and assigned unit. Penal Legionnaire 137 Delta was once perhaps a hive ganger named Corven, a political dissident called Helena, or a corrupt merchant designated Eli Tiberius. The specific details no longer matter to the Imperium. The designation follows a standard format, a numerical batch identifier, followed by a squad assignment letter. This system allows disciplined masters to quickly identify a Legionnaire's processing group and tactical unit without acknowledging their humanity. The most notorious aspect of Penal Legion processing is the surgical implantation of control devices. The standard explosive discipline collar has evolved significantly since the crude devices used during the Great Crusade. Modern collars contain shaped demolition charges designed to sever the head cleanly while minimizing damage to equipment that might be salvaged. The devices incorporate redundant detonation systems, typically a remote trigger, a timer function, and a biometric monitor that activates if the wearer strays beyond designated operational parameters. For specialized penal units or particularly high-risk prisoners, more elaborate control mechanisms are employed. The pacifier harness extends the explosive components down the spine, ensuring total bodily destruction upon activation. For penal heavy weapons teams, compliance gauntlets are fused directly to the hands and wired to the primary weapon systems, preventing the Legionnaire from abandoning their assigned weapon and detonating if unauthorized firing patterns are detected. The surgical procedures are performed with industrial efficiency rather than medical precision. Munitorum Medicae units, assisted by servitors, process hundreds of new Legionnaires daily at larger facilities. Anesthesia is minimal, typically a single injection of combat stims designed more to prevent movement during the procedure than to alleviate pain. The psychological impact of experiencing the implantation while semi-conscious is considered a valuable first step in breaking the prisoner's will. Veteran discipline Master Carrick, formerly of the Cadian 112th Infantry before his demotion for striking a commissar, described the process in a rare authorized interview. The screaming stops after the first few hundred. By then they understand resistance changes nothing. The smart ones lie still and accept the collar. The others bleed more. Following implantation, penal legionnaires undergo what the Adeptus Munitorum generously terms training. This bears little resemblance to the months or years of drilling experienced by standard guard recruits. Penal training typically lasts between 3 and 7 days, focused almost exclusively on basic weapon handling, formation movement, and response to command signals. The abbreviated training regimen reflects the Penal Legion's tactical purpose. These units are not expected to execute complex maneuvers or demonstrate individual initiative. Their primary function is to advance in mass formations, absorb enemy fire, and identify defensive positions through their casualties. A penal legionnaire needs only to understand how to march forward, fire their weapon in the general direction of the enemy, and die in a manner that provides useful tactical information to the regular forces following behind. Training methods emphasize conditioning over skill development. Hypno-indoctrination helmets, similar to those used for rapid language acquisition in the Schola Progenium, but calibrated to much higher, often dangerous intensity levels, implant basic battlefield responses directly into the Legionnaire's subconscious. Many emerge from these sessions with nosebleeds, retinal hemorrhaging, or minor brain damage, acceptable costs given their expendable status. Physical conditioning follows a similar philosophy of brutal efficiency. Rather than progressive training to build strength and endurance, penal legionnaires undergo stress inoculation, extended periods of sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and forced marches while wearing full equipment loads. Those who collapse are revived with stimulants and forced to continue. Those who cannot continue despite chemical assistance are typically executed as examples, their designations immediately reassigned to replacement prisoners. Psychological conditioning represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of penal legion preparation, drawing on millennia of imperial experience breaking human will. The process combines several approaches: religious indoctrination by ministorum redemptors, constant reinforcement of the legionnaire's worthlessness, and the creation of artificial dependency on unit structure and command hierarchy. Ministorum redemptors employ a carefully calibrated blend of hope and despair. They preach endlessly about the possibility of spiritual redemption through sacrifice while emphasizing the impossibility of physical survival. This creates a psychological state where legionnaires simultaneously believe death is inevitable yet meaningful, the perfect mindset for troops expected to advance into certain destruction. The destruction of self-worth occurs through continuous degradation. Legionnaires are never addressed as individuals, only by their designations, and these designations are deliberately changed at random intervals to prevent forming new identity attachments. They eat, sleep, and eliminate waste communally, with no allowance for privacy. Personal hygiene is permitted only as necessary to prevent disease outbreaks that might affect unit combat effectiveness. Perhaps most insidiously, the training process systematically creates dependency by alternating extreme punishment with minor rewards. A legionnaire who correctly disassembles a lasgun might receive an extra ration bar, only to have it publicly taken away for an imperceptible flaw in their uniform. This unpredictable reinforcement schedule, combined with the constant threat of collar detonation, produces a population desperate for any sign of approval from authority figures. Weaponry training for penal legionnaires focuses on quantity of fire rather than accuracy. Most receive the most basic models of M36 lasguns, often salvaged from battlefields and minimally reconditioned. These weapons are permanently set to full auto discharge, maximizing power consumption while minimizing effectiveness, a configuration that reinforces the legionnaire's role as a mobile firing platform rather than a skilled combatant. Specialized penal units receive more focused training appropriate to their assigned roles. Bomber squads learn to carry and place demolition charges, typically with the explosives strapped directly to their bodies as additional motivation. Chem dogs train with toxic gas dispensers and learn to advance through contaminated zones where even regular guard troops in standard issue rebreathers would hesitate. The notorious scythe squads practice close formation advances with fixed bayonets, creating human wave attacks designed to overwhelm enemy positions through sheer mass. Equipment issued to penal legionnaires reflects their disposable status. Their flak armor, when provided at all, is typically salvaged from battlefield casualties and minimally repaired. The distinctive uniform of most penal units, a crude one-piece coverall in drab brown or gray, is manufactured from the cheapest synthetic materials, offering minimal protection against the elements and no camouflage value. Some units receive identifying markings, such as the red diagonal stripe used by the Savler Chem dogs, or the skull emblems painted onto the backs of the Terminus Penal Battalion. The final stage before deployment involves unit formation and command structure establishment. Penal legionnaires are organized into squads of 10, each led by a trustee, typically a longer-serving legionnaire who has demonstrated sufficient reliability to be granted limited authority. 5 squads form a platoon under the command of a discipline master, usually a disgraced guard non-commissioned officer. 10 platoons constitute a company, led by a legion marshal who reports directly to the regular guard command structure. This organizational approach creates a buffer between regular imperial forces and the penal units. Guard commanders issue orders to legion marshals, who interpret them for their subordinates. This chain of command ensures that penal legionnaires never receive the full strategic picture. They know only their immediate objectives, typically expressed in the simplest possible terms. Advance to a specific coordinate, hold a position until a signal is given, or attack a designated target. The night before deployment, penal legionnaires undergo a final ritual that completes their transformation. A ceremony combining military procedure with religious overtones, they formally renounce their past identities and accept their status as the emperor's condemned. Each legionnaire steps forward when their designation is called, receives the unit insignia branded onto their shoulder or chest, and recites the penal oath. My life is forfeit, my death is service, only in sacrifice may I be redeemed. By morning, they are no longer criminals awaiting punishment, but penal legionnaires prepared for deployment. Their past crimes, whether desertion from guard service, political dissidence, or violent offenses, have been subsumed into their new identity. As they board the transport ships that will carry them to the front lines, they represent one of the Imperium's most terrible and pragmatic innovations, the transformation of human failing into expendable military assets. The organizational framework of Imperial Penal Legions represents a perverse mirror of standard Astra Militarum structures, designed not for battlefield efficiency, but for expendability and control. At the most basic level, Penal Legions operate in 10-man squads, designated by alphanumeric codes rather than the honorific names granted to regular guard units. These squads form the smallest functional unit capable of conducting basic military operations while maintaining sufficient numbers to absorb casualties. Each penal squad is typically led by a trustee, a legionnaire who has survived long enough to demonstrate basic competence and compliance. Trustees wear no rank insignia, but can be identified by a yellow stripe painted across their shoulders, or, in some legions, by marginally better equipment. The position carries minimal privilege, perhaps an extra ration pack or exemption from the most degrading camp duties, but enormous responsibility. Trustees who fail to maintain discipline or meet objectives often face summary execution by disciplined masters, creating a perpetual climate of fear that cascades down the command chain. 5 squads combine to form a platoon of approximately 50 legionnaires, commanded by a disciplined master. Unlike trustees, who remain penal legionnaires themselves, disciplined masters occupy a distinct position in the hierarchy. Most are former Astra Militarum non-commissioned officers who committed minor infractions, striking a superior, losing valuable equipment, or displaying cowardice not quite severe enough to merit execution. Their position offers a path to redemption less lethal than frontline penal service, but scarcely less brutal. Disciplined masters wear distinctive black uniforms with red trim, marking them as separate from both the legionnaires they command and the regular guard officers they serve. Their primary weapon is not the standard issue lasgun, but the shock maul, a power weapon capable of delivering incapacitating electrical discharges. Each also carries a detonator control unit linked to the explosive collars of their assigned legionnaires, typically worn on the wrist for immediate access. The relationship between disciplined masters and their charges blends military command with punitive oversight. They issue tactical orders, but spend equal time enforcing compliance through physical punishment, collar detonation threats, or actual executions. The Adeptus Munitorum training manuals for disciplined masters emphasize psychological manipulation, maintaining a precise balance of terror and hope that keeps legionnaires functioning without driving them to suicidal desperation or rebellion. 10 platoons form a company of approximately 500 legionnaires, commanded by a legion marshal. These officers represent the highest authority within the Penal Legion structure and serve as the interface with regular Astra Militarum command. Legion marshals fall into 3 categories: disgraced guard officers seeking redemption, ambitious Schola Progenium graduates using penal command as a stepping stone to more prestigious assignments, or career penal officers who have developed specialized expertise in managing condemned troops. Legion marshals wear uniforms similar to standard guard officers, but with black replacing the usual regimental colors and a distinctive silver skull badge on their caps. Their authority extends beyond simple military command. They can order summary executions, reassign legionnaires between units, and even grant limited pardons for exceptional service. This broad discretionary power makes them feared figures even among the disciplined masters. The battalion level represents the largest standard penal formation, comprising approximately 5,000 legionnaires organized into 10 companies. Battalions operate under a senior marshal, who typically maintains a small personal staff of adjutants and logistics officers. Unlike regular guard regiments, penal battalions lack dedicated support elements such as artillery or armor. They function primarily as infantry formations designed to absorb enemy fire and conduct frontal assaults. Some penal legions maintain formations larger than the battalion level, but these exist more as administrative designations than functional battlefield units. The notorious 13th Penitent Legion, for example, reportedly numbers over 100,000 legionnaires spread across dozens of conflict zones in the Segmentum Tempestus. These legionnaires share a designation and general operational doctrine, but fight in separate battalions under local guard command rather than as a unified force. The command structure within penal legions deliberately creates barriers between regular imperial forces and the condemned troops. Guard commanders issue orders to legion marshals, who interpret and simplify them for disciplined masters, who further reduce them to basic directives for trustees and their squads. This chain ensures that penal legionnaires never receive complete strategic information. They know only immediate objectives, typically expressed as coordinates to advance toward or positions to hold. Commissars occupy a unique position within the penal legion command structure. While regular guard units typically have one commissar assigned per company or battalion, penal formations maintain a higher ratio, often one per platoon in high-risk deployments. These commissars, assigned from the officio praefectus, serve a different function than their counterparts in standard regiments. Rather than maintaining morale and political loyalty, their primary duty involves ensuring that penal legionnaires fulfill their intended tactical purpose as expendable assets. The relationship between commissars and legion marshals often generates tension. While marshals technically command the penal formations, commissars possess independent authority derived directly from the officio praefectus. A commissar can countermand a marshal's orders if they believe those orders deviate from the strategic intent of higher command or fail to properly utilize the penal troops in their intended role as shock absorbers for enemy fire. Commissars assigned to penal legions typically come from one of two backgrounds. Some are newly graduated from the Schola Progenium, assigned to penal units to gain battlefield experience in a context where errors in judgment affect only condemned criminals rather than valuable guard troops. Others are veteran commissars who committed minor infractions or political missteps, not serious enough to merit execution, but sufficient to warrant reassignment to less prestigious duties. These penal commissars wear the standard black uniform and peaked cap that identifies their office throughout the Imperium, but with subtle modifications. Many adopt red gloves rather than the traditional black, symbolizing their constant immersion in the blood of the condemned. Their bolt pistols often feature modified grips to accommodate the detonator controls for explosive collars, allowing them to execute both individual legionnaires and entire squads with equal efficiency. Disciplined masters represent perhaps the most distinctive element of penal legion command. Unlike commissars, who receive their authority from the officio praefectus, or legion marshals, who derive their position from the broader astra militarum hierarchy, disciplined masters exist solely within the penal system. Their training focuses not on tactics or strategy, but on control mechanisms, how to maintain order among troops who have nothing to lose beyond the manner of their inevitable death. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains specialized training facilities for disciplined masters on several worlds, the largest being the infamous Collar Academy on Foros Prime. Here, candidates undergo a 6-month program that combines crowd control techniques, psychological manipulation strategies, and practical experience managing small groups of actual penal legionnaires in controlled environments. The training emphasizes detachment. Disciplined masters learn to view their charges not as soldiers or even humans, but as expendable tools to be used and discarded according to tactical necessity. The mortality rate among disciplined masters approaches that of the legionnaires themselves, though for different reasons. While penal troops die from enemy fire, disciplined masters face threats from both sides of the battlefield. Enemy forces target them specifically to disrupt penal unit cohesion, while disgruntled legionnaires occasionally manage to overcome their conditioning long enough to attack their tormentors. The average life expectancy of a newly assigned discipline master is approximately 18 months of active service. The spiritual dimension of Penal Legion service necessitates the integration of Adeptus Ministorum personnel into the command structure. Each penal battalion includes several redemptors, specialized priests who combine the roles of spiritual guide and psychological enforcer. These clerics preach constantly about redemption through sacrifice, reinforcing the notion that a glorious death in service to the Emperor washes away all past sins. Redemptors wear modified ministorum vestments in black and gray rather than the usual white and gold, often incorporating elements of military uniform, such as armored chest plates or campaign medals. Many augment their appearance with mechanical enhancements, vox amplifiers to ensure their sermons reach entire formations, ocular implants to identify wavering faith among the ranks, or mechadendrites that allow them to dispense both blessings and punishment simultaneously. The theological approach varies between different redemptors. Some emphasize the Emperor's mercy, promising that those who die bravely will find their souls cleansed and welcomed into his light. Others focus on retribution, describing in graphic detail the eternal torments awaiting those who fail to atone through proper sacrifice. The most effective combine both approaches, creating a psychological framework where death becomes not something to fear, but the only possible path to salvation. Redemptors coordinate closely with discipline masters, creating a two-pronged approach to controlling penal legionnaires. While discipline masters maintain order through physical coercion and the threat of immediate punishment, redemptors provide the psychological conditioning that makes legionnaires accept, and sometimes even embrace, their expendable status. This combination of temporal and spiritual authority proves remarkably effective at transforming even the most hardened criminals into compliant cannon fodder. The relationship between Penal Legion units and regular Astra Militarum forces remains carefully regulated. Standard operational procedure maintains physical separation between condemned troops and regular guardsmen whenever possible, with direct interaction limited to necessary battlefield coordination. This segregation serves multiple purposes, preventing contamination of guard morale, reducing opportunities for penal legionnaires to acquire weapons or equipment that might enable escape attempts, and reinforcing the social stigma attached to penal service. Communication between regular guard officers and penal formations occurs almost exclusively through legion marshals. Guard commanders issue orders specifying objectives, timeframes, and acceptable casualty parameters, but rarely dictate specific tactics. Legion marshals then determine how best to employ their condemned troops to meet these requirements, typically selecting approaches that satisfy the strategic need while ensuring maximum visibility of penal sacrifice to regular forces. This command relationship creates a peculiar dynamic on the battlefield. Guard officers view penal legions as disposable assets, useful for absorbing enemy fire, triggering hidden defenses, or testing the strength of opposition, but not as troops worthy of protection or conservation. Tactical decisions often deliberately sacrifice penal units to preserve regular guard formations, a calculus made explicit in Adeptus Munitorum planning documents that assign different value coefficients to different types of imperial forces. The practical implementation of this command philosophy manifests in distinctive battlefield deployments. Penal legions typically advance in the first wave of assaults, marching in tight formations that maximize casualties from enemy fire but reveal defensive positions. Regular guard units follow at a calculated distance, using the information gained from penal casualties to identify optimal attack vectors. In defensive operations, penal units occupy the most exposed positions, serving as early warning systems and speed bumps for enemy advances rather than genuine defensive lines. Despite their expendable status, penal legions maintain internal administrative structures necessary for basic military function. Each battalion includes a small cadre of logistics officers responsible for tracking equipment, processing replacement troops, and coordinating with Adeptus Munitorum supply chains. These officers, typically drawn from administratum clerks convicted of minor infractions, wear distinctive green-gray uniforms that identify their non-combat role. The supply chains serving Penal Legions operate separately from those supporting regular guard units, reflecting their lower priority and different equipment needs. Dedicated transport ships, often converted bulk cargo vessels rather than proper military transports, deliver batches of new legionnaires to replace casualties, along with minimal ammunition and equipment. These shipments arrive on irregular schedules determined more by administratum convenience than battlefield necessity, creating perpetual shortages that Legion marshals must manage through careful rationing and salvage operations. The arsenal of the Imperial Penal Legions reflects their expendable status within the Imperium's war machine. Unlike the sacred weapons entrusted to Space Marines, or even the standardized equipment issued to regular guardsmen, Penal Legionnaires receive what amounts to military refuse, weapons and gear deemed insufficient for troops the Imperium actually values. Standard issue for most Penal Legionnaires begins with the M36 lasgun, though rarely in its original condition. These weapons typically arrive as battlefield salvage, recovered from dead guardsmen and subjected to minimal reconditioning. Tech priests rarely waste their valuable time on Penal Legion equipment, leaving repair work to servitors programmed with only the most basic maintenance protocols. The resulting weapons function, usually, but suffer from numerous deficiencies. Penal issue lasguns commonly exhibit power pack connection problems, causing fluctuating energy output that makes accurate fire nearly impossible beyond short range. Their barrels, often scored from overuse or improper cleaning, scatter las beams unpredictably. The weapon's machine spirits, neglected and abused, develop temperamental behaviors, some refusing to fire in cold conditions, others overheating after minimal use. Adeptus Munitorum quartermasters classify these defects as acceptable performance variances for condemned grade equipment. These degraded weapons serve the Penal Legion's tactical purpose. Their unreliability encourages legionnaires to advance closer to enemy positions, while their tendency to malfunction after sustained fire discourages the condemned from attempting to preserve their lives through cautious long-range engagements. The Munitorum supplies each legionnaire with 4 power packs, half the standard guard allotment, further ensuring aggressive close-range tactics. Armor provided to Penal Legionnaires barely deserves the designation. Most receive flak board, a simplified version of standard Imperial flak armor consisting of a single rigid chest plate made from compressed fabric layers soaked in impact-resistant resin. These plates, worn over the standard drab brown or gray penal coveralls, might stop glancing lasgun hits or shell fragments, but offer no protection against direct fire from any military-grade weapon. Some penal formations don't receive even this minimal protection. The Savler Chem dogs, notorious for their deployment in toxic environments, wear only treated cloth coveralls designed to provide limited resistance against caustic substances. The 9th Penitent Battalion, known as Skin Takers for their deployment against Dark Eldar raiders, operate without any torso protection, their exposed flesh intended to draw the enemy's attention and satisfy their perverse desires for exposed human targets. Helmets, when provided, consist of salvaged guard equipment stripped of communication equipment and auto senses. The resulting headgear offers basic impact protection, but lacks the tactical advantages of proper military helmets. Some penal units receive distinctive helmet modifications, marking their condemned status: the skull-painted faceplates of the Capic Penal Legion, or the bright red helmet stripes of the Mordian condemned companies. Footwear represents a particular concern for penal quartermasters. The constant marching and harsh deployment conditions experienced by legionnaires necessitate somewhat functional boots, yet the Munitorum remains reluctant to waste quality equipment on the condemned. The compromise typically manifests as Pattern 92 reduced quality combat boots, simplified versions of standard guard footwear made with synthetic materials rather than leather and lacking waterproof membranes or proper arch support. The most distinctive element of Penal Legion equipment, the explosive discipline devices, has evolved through centuries of refinement. The standard issue explosive collar contains approximately 20 grams of concentrated hexogen compound, sufficient to ensure complete decapitation while minimizing damage to salvageable equipment. The devices incorporate multiple detonation systems, remote activation from command units, timer functions for suicide missions, and proximity triggers that activate if the wearer strays beyond designated operational parameters. Collar technology varies between different penal formations. The Terrax pattern used by most standard penal units features a relatively quick detonation designed for disciplinary executions. The Armageddon variant, deployed primarily with deep strike penal formations, includes delayed action fuses that allow commanders to activate collars even when beyond standard communication range. The infamous Penitent's Mercy, reserved for the most dangerous criminals, incorporates neural probes that trigger detonation upon detecting thoughts of rebellion or escape, a technology of dubious reliability but tremendous psychological impact. Beyond these standard control devices, specialized penal units employ more elaborate systems tailored to their tactical roles. Bomber squads, condemned troops used for suicide attacks against fortified positions, wear full torso explosive harnesses containing up to 5 kilograms of high explosive compound. These harnesses feature shaped charges designed to direct the blast forward, maximizing damage to enemy fortifications while ensuring the complete obliteration of the Legionnaire. The Mordian 11th Penitent Battalion, specialized in anti-armor operations, carries adherence charges, flat explosive packs attached to the Legionnaire's palms and chest. These troops are expected to rush enemy vehicles, slap the charges against vulnerable points, and either accept their deaths in the subsequent detonation or activate their collars to avoid capture. Adeptus Munitorum efficiency, experts calculate that each such Legionnaire costs approximately 1/15 the resources of a conventional anti-tank weapon, while providing comparable effectiveness against light to medium armor. For penal heavy weapons teams, the Munitorum employs compliance gauntlets, explosive devices fused directly to the hands and wired to the weapon systems. These prevent Legionnaires from abandoning their assigned heavy weapons under fire and detonate if unauthorized firing patterns are detected. The resulting bond between operator and weapon ensures that penal heavy weapons teams fight to the death, extracting maximum value from the relatively expensive equipment entrusted to them. The deliberate psychological impact of these control devices extends beyond their practical function. The constant weight of the collar or harness serves as a perpetual reminder of the Legionnaire's condemned status. The devices are deliberately designed to be uncomfortable, collars positioned to chafe against neck veins, harnesses that restrict full breathing, gauntlets that cause progressive nerve damage with extended use. This discomfort reinforces the message that relief comes only through death, preferably in a manner that serves the Emperor's purposes. While most penal Legionnaires receive substandard versions of conventional guard equipment, certain specialized formations obtain non-standard weaponry suited to their particular deployment profiles. The Chem Dog battalions carry modified flamer units designed to disperse toxic compounds rather than promethium, creating chemical contamination zones that deny territory to advancing enemies. These weapons, deemed too indiscriminate for regular guard use, find appropriate application in the hands of the condemned. The Savlar 8th, a penal formation with a reputation for effectiveness against tyrannid swarms, receives sonic disruptor weapons that proved too dangerous for conventional troops due to inadequate shielding. These weapons emit high-frequency sound waves that rupture tyrannid carapaces, but also cause progressive hearing damage and internal bleeding in their human operators, an acceptable trade-off when those operators are already sentenced to death. Perhaps the most disturbing specialized equipment appears in penal units deployed against chaos forces. The Inquisition occasionally provides these formations with modified neural implants that render the recipient temporarily immune to certain chaos influences, while accelerating their eventual mental deterioration. Legionnaires so equipped can operate in warp-contaminated environments for approximately 72 hours before succumbing to fatal neural collapse, sufficient time to complete most assault missions against chaos positions. Logistics for penal legions operate on principles of minimal investment for maximum expenditure. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains separate supply chains for condemned units, ensuring that quality equipment never mistakenly reaches those deemed unworthy of it. These supply chains function as the final destination for military equipment that would otherwise be scrapped, weapons that have failed quality control, armor damaged beyond standard repair parameters, rations approaching expiration. The Munitorum's Condemned Supply Codex explicitly states that penal legions receive priority only for equipment with zero residual value to standard Imperial forces. This classification encompasses a surprising variety of material, experimental weapons with unacceptable failure rates, armor manufactured from substitute materials during production shortages, combat stims that produce effective short-term results but catastrophic long-term side effects. Transport vehicles assigned to penal formations exemplify this approach. While regular guard units receive purpose-built chimeras or toroxes, penal legions typically travel in repurposed civilian pattern transports, essentially commandeered cargo haulers with minimal armor plating welded to their exteriors. These vehicles lack the defensive capabilities and tactical flexibility of proper military transports, but adequately deliver condemned troops to their deployment zones, which satisfies the Munitorum's requirements. The notoriously pragmatic Colonel Jerton of the Death Corps of Krieg reportedly commented that penal legion supply strategy represents the purest expression of imperial military logistics, maximum extraction of value from resources already written off. This philosophy extends even to the recovery of equipment from fallen legionnaires. After engagements, special recovery teams collect usable gear from penal casualties, prioritizing weapons, ammunition, and intact boots, items perpetually in short supply. Occasionally, the specialized skills of certain condemned criminals lead to non-standard equipment assignments that seemingly contradict the Munitorum's general approach. Former Imperial Navy technicians sentenced to penal service might receive relatively sophisticated Auspex units if their deployment involves identifying hidden enemy positions. Convicted Medicae workers sometimes retain field surgical kits, not from concern for penal casualties, but to ensure wounded regular guardsmen can receive emergency treatment if no other medical personnel are available. The 17th Penitent Engineering Battalion, composed primarily of convicted Mechanicus adepts and industrial saboteurs, represents an extreme example of this pragmatic exception. These legionnaires receive almost functional servo harnesses and demolition equipment that would normally be reserved for proper engine seer teams. The explosive collars for this unit feature particularly sophisticated machine spirit interlocks that detonate if the legionnaires attempt to modify or repair their equipment beyond authorized parameters. The infamous Butcher's Bill Penal Battalion, composed entirely of convicted chirurgeons and Medicae personnel, carries field surgical equipment and combat stims to perform emergency battlefield procedures. Their collars incorporate toxin injectors that activate if they attempt to treat fellow penal legionnaires rather than valuable guard troops, a restriction that transforms potential healers into particularly bitter and fatalistic condemned troops. For most penal legionnaires, personal equipment beyond their assigned weapons consists of a condemned field kit, a standardized collection of absolute minimum survival gear. This typically includes a canteen, a simplified entrenching tool with an intentionally weakened handle to prevent its use as an improvised weapon, and a single bandage packet containing basic wound dressing and a mild analgesic. Rations for penal troops reflect both their expendable status and the Imperium's waste reduction principles. Standard issue consists of Type P nutrition bars, compressed blocks of protein, carbohydrates, and synthetic vitamins formulated to provide approximately 1,800 calories daily. These rations, notorious for their unpleasant taste and texture, typically comprise ingredients deemed unsuitable for regular guard consumption, protein derived from insect farms, grain salvaged from contaminated agricultural worlds, but processed to minimally acceptable safety levels, and synthetic nutrients produced as byproducts from Mechanicus Forge World operations. The Adeptus Munitorum justifies this approach through cold efficiency calculations. Internal documents reference the diminishing return threshold for penal equipment, the point at which additional investment in condemned troops produces less benefit than directing those resources toward regular forces. This threshold sits remarkably low, with Munitorum analysts concluding that penal legionnaires equipped at approximately 30% of standard guard levels achieve 80% of the tactical utility required from expendable shock troops. This calculation ignores certain hidden costs. The substandard equipment contributes to higher casualty rates, necessitating more frequent replacement of penal troops and additional administrative burden on the Imperium's penal system. The psychological impact of obvious equipment discrimination sometimes fosters resentment that even explosive collars cannot fully suppress, occasionally resulting in penal units that perform below expected parameters or, in rare cases, attempt despite the consequences to turn their weapons against their imperial overseers. The Officio Praefectus acknowledges these risks, but considers them acceptable within the broader strategic framework. Commissar Lieutenant Varen's widely distributed training text, Management of Condemned Assets, specifically addresses the equipment disparity. The visible inferiority of penal wargear serves multiple functions beyond resource conservation. It reinforces the legionnaire's expendable status, maintains appropriate separation between condemned and proper imperial forces, and ensures that even successful penal operations cannot be mistakenly attributed to equipment quality rather than the emperor's while working through even the least worthy of his servants. In rare instances where penal legions achieve unexpected tactical success, equipment allocation temporarily improves. The redemption companies that distinguished themselves during the Third War for Armageddon received functional flak armor and properly maintained lasguns as reward for their effectiveness against orc forces. This improved equipment came with increased expectations for performance, however, with subsequent deployment orders specifying higher acceptable casualty thresholds and more ambitious objectives. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains an ambivalent relationship with penal legion equipment. While tech priests generally disdain wasting their attention on substandard materiel destined for the condemned, certain Mechanicus factions view penal deployments as valuable field testing opportunities. Experimental weapon variants too unreliable for proper field trials sometimes find their way into penal arsenals, allowing the Mechanicus to gather performance data without risking valuable equipment or troops. The deployment of penal legions across the battlefields of the 41st millennium follows a grim calculus of expendability. Imperial commanders view these formations not as soldiers to be preserved, but as biological assets to be consumed in service to tactical objectives. This fundamental difference shapes every aspect of their battlefield utilization, from initial deployment to withdrawal conditions, which rarely include provisions for penal legion survival. Most penal legion engagements begin with what the Adeptus Munitorum euphemistically terms reconnaissance by casualty. Legionnaires advance in tight formations across suspected minefields or toward enemy positions of unknown strength, their deaths providing valuable tactical data to regular imperial forces waiting behind them. Munitorum tactical assessment from the Sabbat Worlds campaign coldly notes, penal advance patterns revealed 83% of hidden chaos heavy weapon emplacements at a cost of 412 condemned assets, an acceptable exchange rate given the preservation of 2 chimera companies that would have otherwise been required for the same reconnaissance function. The infamous forlorn hope doctrine represents perhaps the most notorious application of penal legions in imperial warfare. Dating back to the Great Crusade, this approach positions condemned troops as the first wave in assaults against heavily fortified positions. The legionnaires receive minimal briefing, typically just a direction of advance and an objective marker, before being driven forward by disciplined masters and the threat of collar detonation. Their purpose is not to capture the objective, but to draw fire, deplete enemy ammunition reserves, and reveal defensive strongpoints through their deaths. Lord General Michael Crassus, architect of the Caledar offensive, described the doctrine with characteristic imperial pragmatism. the Forlorn Hope serves dual purposes. It eliminates enemy ammunition that might otherwise be expended on valuable troops, while simultaneously eliminating criminals who would otherwise consume valuable Imperial resources. The Emperor's efficiency manifests in many forms. His campaign journals note that during the assault on Hive Tertius, 3 successive waves of Penal Legionnaires, approximately 4,000 troops, were sacrificed to identify and exhaust the ammunition of Chaos heavy stubber nests before regular guard units advanced. The tactical integration of Penal Legions with regular Imperial forces follows strict protocols designed to maximize their utility while minimizing their potential for disruption. Standard deployment places commissariat execution squads directly behind penal formations, typically positioned on elevated ground with clear firing lines. These squads, equipped with long-laws weapons and remote detonator controls, serve as the final enforcement mechanism should disciplined masters fail to maintain proper advance rates among the condemned. During the Tarot's campaign against Tau forces, commissariat records document the activation of collar detonators for the entire front rank of the 12th Penitent Battalion when their advance faltered under pulse rifle fire. The sight of 30 simultaneous decapitations provided sufficient motivation for the remaining ranks to continue their advance across the open desert, eventually drawing enough Tau fire to reveal the locations of 3 previously unidentified XV-15 stealth team positions. Penal Legions deployed against Tyrannid swarms face perhaps the most horrific battlefield conditions imaginable. The Adeptus Munitorum has developed specialized tactics for these engagements, designating certain penal formations as consumption units tasked with drawing Tyrannid organisms into pre-planned killing zones. These legionnaires receive stimulant injections that mask their fear responses while amplifying their scent markers, making them particularly attractive targets for Tyrannid bioforms seeking biomass. During the defense of Tarsi's Ultra, 500 legionnaires from the Savlar 9th Penitent Battalion were deployed as mobile bait to lure a Hormigaunt brood into a prepared artillery kill zone. Their explosive collars were modified to remain inactive until manually triggered, ensuring they would remain alive as long as possible to draw the maximum number of Tyrannid organisms into the trap. Imperial records note that the operation successfully eliminated approximately 2,000 Hormigaunts at the cost of all 500 legionnaires, a casualty exchange rate that delighted Munitorum efficiency experts. Against Orc-Waz, Penal Legions serve a different tactical function. Orc psychology responds to visible resistance with increased aggression, making the massed formations of penal troops particularly effective at drawing Orc attention away from more valuable Imperial assets. The Catachan 57th Regiment's victory at Breakback Ridge during the Third War for Armageddon came after 3 successive waves of Penal Legion attacks drew the bulk of Warboss Grimtooth's forces away from the ridge, allowing Catachan infiltrators to approach and eliminate the Orc leadership. Penal Legions deployed against Orcs receive modified equipment loadouts designed to maximize their provocative effect. Bright pennants attached to their backpacks increase visibility, while specially designed Shriek Vox devices emit frequencies that Orcs find particularly challenging to ignore. Some penal units even receive crude melee weapons, not for actual combat effectiveness, but to present the appearance of worthy opponents that Orcs will prioritize over potentially more dangerous, but less visibly aggressive regular guard units. The tactical deployment of Penal Legions against Eldar forces requires particular consideration due to the Xeno's psychological warfare capabilities. Standard Imperial tactics involve using penal formations to absorb the reality-distorting attacks of Eldar Hemlock Wraith fighters and Shadow Specters, their minds considered expendable compared to trained guardsmen. During the Garanus incursion, 3 consecutive companies from the 14th Penal Legion were sacrificed to identify the paths of hidden webway gates, their deaths mapping the Eldar movement corridors more effectively than any Auspex sweep. Perhaps the most disturbing deployment protocols involve Penal Legions facing Chaos forces. The psychological vulnerability of the condemned, their desperation, resentment, and proximity to death makes them particularly susceptible to Chaos influence. Rather than viewing this as a liability, Imperial commanders have developed tactics that weaponize this vulnerability. Penal formations deployed against chaos receive minimal indoctrination against chaos temptation, their inevitable corruption serving as a detection system for warp-tainted areas. During the Purge of Sanctus Reach, Inquisitor Hezekiah Carmelis deliberately positioned the 23rd Penal Battalion along a suspected chaos ritual site perimeter. As the Legionnaires advanced, those who began showing signs of corruption, speaking in tongues, developing spontaneous mutations, or turning on their fellows, provided real-time mapping of the ritual's influence radius. Orbital bombardment coordinates were plotted based on these corruption patterns, effectively using the condemned troops as living warp influence detectors. The integration of penal legions with mechanized Imperial forces follows strict protocols designed to prevent the condemned from accessing valuable vehicles while maximizing their utility as infantry screens. When deployed alongside Leman Russ battle tanks or Chimera transports, penal formations advance in precise patterns that provide cover for the vehicles from infantry portable anti-tank weapons, while remaining outside the minimum firing range of the vehicle's main weapons, ensuring they can be fired upon if they attempt to fall back or deviate from assigned advance routes. During the Siege of Vrax, an innovative guard commander modified this approach by attaching individual penal legionnaires to the hulls of Chimera transports using magnetic restraint cuffs. These human shields deterred enemy tank hunters from targeting the vehicle's vulnerable side armor, while their explosive collars were linked to the transport's machine spirit, detonating if the vehicle suffered critical damage and potentially disabling nearby enemy infantry. The Adeptus Munitorum subsequently standardized this tactic in the Ablative Personnel Carrier Protocol, now used across multiple war zones. The Anvil formation represents one of the most common tactical deployments for penal legions supporting regular guard operations. This approach positions condemned troops in a static line, often in exposed terrain, while mobile guard elements maneuver to drive enemy forces against this human barrier. The penal troops receive simple orders: hold position regardless of casualties until the operation concludes or their position is overrun. Their explosive collars ensure compliance, detonating if individual legionnaires retreat beyond designated fallback markers. During the Macharian Crusade, Lord Solar Macharius famously employed this tactic at the Battle of Demetrius, using 3,000 penal legionnaires as an anvil against which his armored companies hammered an orc horde. Imperial records note that the penal line held for 17 hours despite sustaining over 90% casualties, their fixed position enabling the systematic destruction of orc formations driven against them. Macharius reportedly awarded the surviving legionnaires imperial pardons, though historical accounts differ on whether any actually survived to receive them. Penal legion deployment against fortified positions often takes the form of saturation assault, using sheer numbers to overwhelm defensive fire through volume of targets. Unlike conventional guard attacks, which might employ fire and movement tactics to minimize casualties, penal assaults rely on continuous advance regardless of losses. Disciplined masters drive their charges forward in tightly packed formations, sometimes physically chained together to prevent individuals from seeking cover or retreating. The Siege of Ironlock Station during the Sabbat Worlds Crusade saw an entire penal legion, approximately 10,000 condemned troops, committed to a frontal assault against heavily fortified chaos positions. Imperial planners calculated that even with expected casualty rates of 80–90%, sufficient numbers would reach the walls to overwhelm defenders through sheer mass. The actual operation achieved its objectives with 97.4% penal casualties, a figure the Adeptus Munitorum deemed within acceptable parameters given the strategic value of the position and the negligible value of the assets expended. Urban combat deployments for penal legions typically focus on area clearance operations, sending waves of condemned troops through potentially booby-trapped buildings or mine-sown districts ahead of valuable regular forces. During the reclamation of Hive Volcanus on Armageddon, penal units advanced through the industrial sector without maps or intelligence, their casualties revealing hidden orc positions, trigger mechanisms, and kill zones that would have otherwise claimed Guard veterans. The psychological impact of Penal Legion deployments extends beyond the condemned themselves to affect both enemy forces and regular Imperial troops. Enemy combatants witnessing the relentless advance of penal formations, troops who continue forward despite horrific casualties and make no attempt to take cover or preserve their lives, often experience morale degradation. Meanwhile, Guard units observing the brutal expenditure of penal troops receive an implicit message about the consequences of failure or disobedience. Commissar General Makaroth explicitly acknowledged this dual purpose in his tactical directives during the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. The visible sacrifice of the condemned serves as both tactical asset and spiritual object lesson. Regular guardsmen who witness Penal Legion deployments understand viscerally that even death offers no escape from service to the Emperor. The deployment of Penal Legions alongside Adeptus Astartes forces occurs rarely, as Space Marines generally consider such formations unworthy of fighting alongside the Emperor's finest. When such joint operations do occur, they typically follow a clearing pattern, where penal troops advance first to trigger ambushes or reveal enemy positions before the Astartes strike force delivers the actual killing blow. The Ultramarines' 2nd Company reportedly employed this tactic during the Damnos campaign, using a penal battalion to locate and draw out Necron death marks before launching their own precision assault. Captain Cato Sicarius described the tactic with characteristic bluntness in his campaign report. The condemned served their purpose, drawing the Xenos from hiding with their deaths. The Emperor's justice manifests in many forms: for the alien, swift destruction by Astartes' bolter; for the criminal, a marginally useful death in service to those who matter. During extended campaigns, Penal Legion deployment patterns evolve to account for dwindling numbers and the psychological deterioration of surviving legionnaires. Initial operations typically employ conventional military formations, with the condemned organized into recognizable companies and battalions. As casualties mount and replacement troops fail to arrive in sufficient numbers, disciplined masters consolidate survivors into increasingly desperate, forlorn companies, tasked with increasingly suicidal objectives. By the final stages of their operational life cycle, many penal formations transition to what the Adeptus Munitorum designates terminal deployment, operations designed to extract maximum tactical value from the complete destruction of the unit. These might involve suicide attacks against enemy command structures, contaminated zone traversal without protective equipment, or human wave assaults against fortified positions that regular Guard units have failed to breach through conventional means. The Tanith first and only encountered the remains of such a terminal deployment during their operations on Ex Cardinal, a battlefield strewn with the corpses of an entire penal battalion that had been driven into the guns of a fortified chaos position. Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's field notes described the scene. They died to the last man, advancing in neat ranks directly into overlapping fields of fire. Their disciplined collars had detonated in sequence from the rear ranks forward, ensuring that only forward movement remained possible. A brutal calculus, but one that revealed every enemy gun emplacement through its firing signature. The ultimate expression of Penal Legion tactical doctrine remains the redemption through victory deployment, a one-way operation where an entire formation receives a conditional pardon dependent on achieving an objective deemed virtually impossible. These rare operations typically target critical strategic assets where conventional approaches have failed, offering the condemned a theoretical chance at redemption that motivates performance beyond what could be achieved through collar detonation threats alone. During the defense of Cadia against Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, the Emperors Absolved, a composite penal formation drawn from 17 different condemned units, received such a mission. Their objective: infiltrate and destroy a Chaos Titan support facility behind enemy lines. Imperial records indicate that the operation succeeded, with the facility's destruction confirmed by orbital picked capture. Whether any of the Legionnaires survived to receive their promised pardons remains unrecorded in accessible Imperial archives. The 13th Penal Legion, infamously known as the Last Chancers, stands as perhaps the most documented of all Imperial penal formations. Under the command of the legendary Colonel Schieffer, this unit has operated continuously for over 3 centuries, though its personnel have been replaced countless times over. Unlike standard penal legions that function as disposable mass infantry formations, Schieffer's Last Chancers operate as specialized strike teams composed of criminals with particular skills or abilities deemed useful for high-risk operations. Colonel Schieffer himself remains something of an enigma within Imperial military records. His service file indicates multiple serious wounds that should have proven fatal, yet he continues to lead operations across various war zones. Some Adeptus Munitorum archivists speculate he may be a succession of officers using the same identity, while others suggest extensive rejuvenat treatments or even limited bionic reconstruction. Whatever the truth, Schieffer has developed a reputation for identifying and exploiting the unique talents of the condemned under his command. Schieffer's recruitment methodology differs significantly from standard penal legion practice. Rather than accepting bulk shipments of condemned criminals, he personally visits detention facilities across the Imperium, reviewing prisoner records and conducting individual assessments. His selections often puzzle local authorities, passing over seemingly capable soldiers to choose unstable psychopaths, cowards, or malcontents with specific skills or knowledge relevant to upcoming operations. A typical Last Chancers strike team might include a former guard sniper who murdered his commanding officer, an underhive gang leader with intimate knowledge of urban warfare, a convicted tech heretic capable of bypassing security systems, and a pathological pyromaniac useful for demolition work. Schieffer binds these disparate criminals into functional units through a combination of brutal discipline, the promise of potential pardons, and his uncanny ability to identify and exploit individual motivations. The operational deployment of the Last Chancers invariably involves missions deemed too high risk for valuable troops, but too complex for standard penal formations. During the Crandor Rebellion, Schieffer's team infiltrated the heavily defended Planetary Defense Control Center, disabling shields that had withstood weeks of Imperial bombardment. On Tarsi's Ultra, they destroyed a critical Tyranid synapse node behind enemy lines, temporarily disrupting the hive mind's control over a significant portion of the Xenos swarm. Perhaps their most notorious operation occurred during the Gothic War, when a Last Chancers team infiltrated a space hulk captured by Chaos forces. Disguised as mutant slaves, they planted thermal charges at critical structural points, destroying the hulk as it approached an Imperial Navy anchorage. Imperial records indicate all team members were lost in the explosion, yet Schieffer appeared 3 months later in another sector, recruiting a new team for an equally desperate mission. The mortality rate among Last Chancers approaches 100% per operation, with success often requiring total sacrifice. The rare survivors receive conditional pardons as promised, though Imperial records indicate many of these redeemed criminals eventually reoffend and find themselves once again under Schieffer's command. This pattern has led some commissariat analysts to speculate that the colonel deliberately selects individuals psychologically incapable of reintegration into Imperial society, ensuring a renewable supply of desperate operatives for future missions. Unlike standard penal legions, with their crude explosive collars, Schieffer's teams receive more sophisticated control implants. These devices, surgically embedded at the brainstem, allow for more nuanced enforcement, capable of delivering pain without death when compliance is required, but immediate execution when necessary. The implants include encrypted Vox links that permit secure communication while preventing unauthorized transmissions that might compromise operations. In stark contrast to the specialized operations of the Last Chancers, the Savlar Chem Dogs represent Penal Legion doctrine in its most brutally straightforward application. Recruited primarily from the toxic prison world of Savlar, these legionnaires develop natural resistance to environmental contaminants through lifelong exposure to industrial pollution. The Adeptus Munitorum exploits this physiological adaptation, by deploying chem dog formations in contaminated war zones where even protected regular troops would struggle to function. The standard chem dog legionnaire presents a distinctive appearance that instills unease even among other Imperial forces. Their prison world pallor, coupled with chronic respiratory conditions from toxic exposure, gives them a corpse-like appearance. Many display chemical burns, tissue necrosis, or dermal implants designed to filter toxins, crude augmentations performed by prison medicae with minimal concern for cosmetic outcomes. They're standard-issue rebreathers, necessary even in relatively clean environments due to adapted lung function, add to their unsettling aspect. Chem Dog tactical doctrine centers on the deployment of toxic warfare elements too dangerous for conventional troops to handle. During the Siege of Vrax, the Savlar 8th and 12th Penal Battalions received canisters of experimental Mechanicus compounds designated Atmosphere Excoriator Pattern 9, chemical weapons so volatile they occasionally dissolved their carrying containers. The Legionnaires advanced through zones already contaminated by these weapons, their bodies serving as delivery mechanisms for additional toxins carried in tanks on their backs. The Savlar 14th Penal Legion developed specialized tactics for hive warfare during the Galen 5 suppression campaign. Exploiting their familiarity with toxic environments, they navigated ventilation systems and waste disposal tunnels considered too contaminated for regular troops. Emerging from these access points behind cultist defensive lines, they deployed short-lived but highly concentrated chemical agents before conventional forces advanced through the temporarily cleared zones. Imperial Casualty reports note that many chem dogs survived the initial operations only to die hours later from accumulated toxic exposure. The equipment issued to chem dog formations reflects their specialized role. In addition to substandard versions of standard guard weapons, they receive modified flamer units designed to disperse chemical compounds rather than promethium. These toxin projectors deliver clouds of neuroactive agents that penetrate most civilian-grade rebreathers and cause rapid incapacitation through skin contact alone. The weapon's machine spirits are notoriously temperamental, occasionally releasing toxins backward toward the operator, a design flaw the Adeptus Munitorum has deemed acceptable given deployment parameters. Discipline within chem dog units presents unique challenges. Their constant exposure to toxic compounds frequently results in neurological damage, making standard Imperial motivation techniques less effective. Discipline masters assigned to chem dog formations receive specialized training in managing troops with compromised cognitive function, learning to issue simpler commands, and rely more heavily on immediate physical reinforcement rather than threatened future punishment. The Attica 4 penitents emerged from a more specific conflict context than most penal formations. Originally formed from political prisoners captured during the Imperial suppression of the Attica system uprising, this penal legion has evolved to specialize in operations against the Tiao Empire, particularly in countering their auxiliary client species. Their distinctive tactical doctrine developed through bitter experience during the Damocles Gulf conflict, where initial Imperial assumptions about Tiao warfare proved catastrophically incorrect. The Attica penitents operate under a unique command structure that incorporates condemned xenologists and former planetary officials who had advocated peaceful cooperation with the Tiao before the Imperium reasserted control. These individuals, their political crimes deemed too severe for standard redemption protocols, provide tactical insights into Tiao methods and psychology while serving as trustees within the Legion structure. Their knowledge comes at the cost of constant commissariat surveillance, with execution collars programmed to detonate at the first sign of genuine sympathy for the Xeno's enemy. During the Second Agrellan campaign, the Attica 3rd and 5th Battalions demonstrated their specialized capabilities against Tiao auxiliary forces. While regular guard units struggled against the hit and run tactics of Kroot carnivore squads, the penitents deployed in scattered formations that mimicked the Xeno's own approach, sacrificing unit cohesion for dispersed target profiles. This unorthodox method reduced the effectiveness of Tiao pulse weapon fire, though at the cost of higher casualties from friendly fire incidents, when regular Imperial forces mistook dispersed legionnaires for enemy infiltrators. The Attica penitents have developed particular expertise in countering the mind control tactics of the insectoid vespid species serving the Tiao. During the Daleth offensive, penitent squads equipped with modified Vox emitters broadcast frequencies that disrupted the crystalline communication devices the Tiao used to control their vespid auxiliaries. The operation succeeded in temporarily freeing several vespid swarms from Tiao control, though the resulting chaotic attacks struck both Tiao and Imperial forces indiscriminately. Equipment issued to the Attica penitents includes non-standard items specifically designed for anti-Tiao operations. Their lasguns feature modified power settings that, while reducing overall ammunition efficiency, generate energy signatures that Tiao sensors have difficulty tracking. Some specialized squads receive crude replicas of Tiao communication devices, allowing them to broadcast confusing orders to auxiliary forces or momentarily disrupt the coordination between Tiao commanders and their troops. These technological innovations come at a price. The equipment's unreliability and the mechanicus disapproval of such adaptation mean frequent malfunctions that often prove fatal to the users. The Sabbat Worlds Crusade, that massive Imperial reconquest launched by Warmaster Makaroth, provided perhaps the most thoroughly documented deployment of Penal Legions in recent Imperial history. The extended campaign across multiple worlds created conditions where penal units could occasionally transcend their expendable status through exceptional service, generating rare instances of collective redemption that propagandists eagerly incorporated into Imperial narrative. The 11th Redemptionist Legion, initially comprised of deserters and cowards from Imperial Guard regiments broken during the early phases of the Crusade, achieved unexpected victory during the assault on Formal Prime. Assigned to a diversionary attack expected to result in complete annihilation, the Legion instead successfully breached enemy defenses when a chaos counter-bombardment accidentally collapsed the very walls they were assaulting. Seizing the unexpected opportunity, the Legionnaires pushed forward and secured a critical manufacturing district before regular forces could arrive. Warmaster Makaroth, recognizing the propaganda value of redemption narratives, officially pardoned the surviving Legionnaires and incorporated them into a newly formed Guard regiment. The 18th Penal Battalion, known as the Shriven for the ritual scarification their disciplined masters inflicted as punishment for minor infractions, demonstrated how even condemned troops could achieve a measure of martial pride under appropriate leadership. Colonel Phoenix, a former Guard officer sentenced to penal command after losing a strategic position to retreat without orders, transformed the undisciplined mob through a combination of brutal enforcement and genuine tactical acumen. During the 3-year siege of Vavire Hive, the Shriven held a critical defensive line against 17 major chaos assaults, their casualties never causing a significant withdrawal. Commissariat records note Phoenix's unorthodox motivation methods, which included awarding crude medallions made from spent bolt casings for exceptional service, and establishing a hierarchical system among the condemned that offered minor privileges for survival and performance. Though technically violations of Adeptus Munitorum regulations regarding penal troop management, these innovations produced results sufficient for senior officers to overlook the procedural deviations. When Vavire Hive finally fell to Imperial forces, Warmaster Makaroth personally reviewed the Shriven's service record and commuted the sentences of the 83 survivors. The most dramatic redemption narrative emerged from the Osprey Penal Legion during the battle for Con 3. Comprised primarily of former PDF troops who had initially surrendered to Chaos forces before being recaptured by the Imperial advance, the Osprey Legion carried the double stigma of cowardice and potential corruption. Assigned to clear minefields through the expedient of marching across them, they discovered a previously unidentified network of underground tunnels beneath the impact craters. Taking initiative despite the risk of summary execution for deviating from orders, a trustee designated K-17 led a squad into the tunnel network. They emerged behind enemy lines near a critical artillery position that had been hampering the Imperial advance for weeks. In the confusion of their unexpected appearance, the legionnaires managed to capture the position and turn the guns against other chaos emplacements. Though most died in the subsequent counterattack, their action allowed Imperial forces to advance 7 weeks ahead of schedule. Lord General Bulletin, commanding the Con 3 theater, recognized the strategic significance of their sacrifice by ordering an unprecedented ceremony. The names, not designations, but original names, of the fallen legionnaires were inscribed on the captured artillery pieces, which were then redeployed with regular Imperial forces. This symbolic restoration of identity to the condemned cent ripples through other penal formations, in the Crusade, temporarily improving morale and combat performance across multiple units. The Volpone 23rd Penitent Damned represents one of the more unusual penal formations deployed during the Crusade. Unlike standard penal legions drawn from general criminal populations, this unit consisted entirely of disgraced aristocratic officers from the Volpone Bluebloods regiment. Following a failed offensive that cost thousands of lives through tactical incompetence, 27 Volpone officers faced execution for their failures. Warmaster Makaroth instead sentenced them to lead from the front in a specialized penal company, their noble status replaced with explosive collars no different from those worn by common criminals. These former officers, accustomed to directing troops from secure command posts, found themselves personally leading charges against entrenched chaos positions. Their aristocratic training, emphasizing leadership, tactical analysis, and martial pride, occasionally broke through their desperation, resulting in operations executed with unexpected precision. During the Munthax campaign, the Volpone Penitent Damned successfully coordinated with regular guard units rather than simply serving as expendable shock troops, their former command experience enabling more sophisticated maneuvers than typical penal formations could achieve. After 3 years of frontline deployment and a casualty rate exceeding 80%, the 7 surviving officers received conditional pardons. Rather than restoration to their former status, however, they were assigned as junior lieutenants to line infantry regiments from worlds the Volpone nobility traditionally scorned. This final humbling completed their redemption arc in Imperial propaganda, demonstrating that even the highest could fall and find atonement through genuine service rather than birthright. The annals of Imperial history seldom record the names of those who serve in the Penal Legions. Their identities, stripped upon sentencing, typically vanish into the anonymity of alphanumeric designations and unmarked mass graves. Yet even among these condemned souls, certain individuals have performed acts of such exceptional valor or sacrifice that they transcend their criminal status, earning recognition from an Imperium that had already judged them unworthy. Perhaps no redemption tale resonates more powerfully than that of Sergeant Arctos Gull, formerly designated Penal Legionnaire 7734 Alpha of the Mordian Penitent Battalion. Gull, a former Cadian shock trooper convicted of striking a commissar during the retreat from Tyrock Fields, spent 3 years in penal service before the opportunity for redemption presented itself on the death world of Catachan 7. When Tyranid infiltration beasts breached the command bunker during the defense of Firebase Kappa, Gull led a desperate counterattack with nothing but entrenching tools and bare hands. Imperial records confirm that Gull personally killed 3 Tyranid warriors, suffering mortal wounds but surviving long enough to seal the bunker's blast doors, preserving the command staff and strategic defense plans for the entire subsector. Lord General Stern, impressed by this display of valor, posthumously restored Gull's name and rank, ordering it inscribed on the Firebase Kappa Memorial alongside those of regular guardsmen who fell in the campaign. This exceptional recognition sparked controversy among more conservative Imperial commanders, who argued that redemptive acts, no matter how significant, should not elevate the condemned to equal status with loyal soldiers. The debate reached the Adeptus Munitorum's highest levels before Stern's decision was upheld, establishing a precedent that has allowed for similar recognitions in subsequent campaigns. The case of Tech Adept Drusus Cord demonstrates how specialized skills can sometimes elevate a penal legionnaire beyond their condemned status. Cord, sentenced to penal service for unauthorized modification of Mechanicus equipment on Graea, found himself deployed with the 103rd Penal Legion during the Medusa 5 campaign, when an ancient Mechanicus vault was uncovered during combat operations against Necron forces. The regular techpriests assigned to the expedition proved unable to bypass its security systems. Cord, recognizing patterns in the vault's machine's spirit from his illicit studies, requested permission to attempt access. The Mechanicus representatives initially refused, unwilling to allow a convicted tech heretic near sacred technology. As Necron forces closed in, however, desperation overrode dogma. Cord not only opened the vault, but recognized the archaeotech weapons stored within, providing crucial instruction on their emergency activation. The resulting energy discharge destroyed the advancing Necron phalanx, saving 3 guard regiments from certain destruction. In an almost unprecedented move, the Adeptus Mechanicus not only pardoned Cord, but offered him reinstatement into their ranks, though under the perpetual supervision of a senior techpriest. Leadership within penal legions typically falls to disgraced officers seeking their own redemption, but few have transformed their commands as dramatically as Colonel Myra Fenks of the Fantine Penal Battalion. Fenks, formerly a decorated officer in the Elysian Drop Troops, received a penal legion command sentence after refusing a direct order that would have sacrificed her entire company for minimal tactical gain. Rather than accepting the traditional role of penal commanders, driving the condemned forward as expendable assets, Fenks applied legitimate tactical principles to her new command. During the Gerian resistance campaign, Fenks reorganized her penal troops into specialized infiltration teams, utilizing their desperation as motivation rather than merely exploiting it through threats. She personally removed the explosive collars from legionnaires who demonstrated reliability, replacing them with less lethal but still effective control measures. This modification allowed her troops greater operational flexibility while maintaining necessary discipline. Under her command, the Fantine Penal Battalion successfully conducted 17 high-risk operations behind enemy lines, providing critical intelligence that shaped the eventual liberation strategy. Lord Militant General Barthol van Voigts, impressed by these results, conducted a formal review of Fenks's case. Finding that her original insubordination had likely saved hundreds of lives without compromising strategic objectives, he issued a conditional pardon contingent upon her continued command of the Fantine Penal Battalion until campaign completion. This unusual arrangement, a pardoned officer leading condemned troops, created a unique dynamic that further improved the unit's performance. After the Gerian campaign concluded, Fenks received full reinstatement to regular guard command, while 37 of her penal troops earned commuted sentences for exceptional service. The sacrifice of the Kanak 11th Penal Company during the Third War for Armageddon stands as perhaps the most costly redemption in recent Imperial history. Assigned to defend a minor promethium refinery considered strategically expendable, the company of 120 legionnaires found themselves directly in the path of an orc speed freak advance. Their commanding discipline master, executed by his own troops in the opening hours of the battle, had attempted to abandon the position despite orders to hold at all costs. Legionnaire 2271 Delta, a former PDF sergeant convicted of cowardice during a previous orc incursion, assumed informal command. Recognizing the refinery's volatile nature, he organized a fighting retreat that drew the orc vehicles into the facility itself. Using their explosive collars as improvised demolition charges, the legionnaires triggered a chain reaction that destroyed the entire refinery complex, along with an estimated 2,000 orc warriors and dozens of vehicles. Imperial analysts later determined that this action delayed the orc advance by 72 hours, providing crucial time for civilian evacuation from 3 nearby settlement clusters. Commissar Yarrick himself reviewed the action report and ordered that Legionnaire 2271 Delta's original name, Toron Vex, be added to the Hellsreach Memorial, the only penal legionnaire so honored. The Commissar's accompanying note simply stated, "Cowardice is the failure to act when duty demands." By this measure, Vex died no coward. The redemption of St. Catherine's Bridge during the Vrax campaign demonstrated how exceptional leadership could transform even the most degraded penal formations into effective fighting units. Major Darren Kosk, assigned to command the 17th Penal Battalion after a political dispute with a superior officer, inherited a unit notorious for its high desertion attempts and frequent disciplinary executions. Rather than continuing the punitive approach of his predecessors, Kosk implemented structural reforms that offered graduated privileges for reliable performance. When tasked with holding St. Catherine's Bridge, a critical supply route supporting 3 Guard regiments, against a massive traitor militia assault, Kosk deployed his troops in a defense in depth rather than the typical Penal Legion frontal screen. He positioned his most reliable squads as mobile reserves while using newer, less trusted legionnaires in prepared positions with clearer escape prevention measures. When the attack came, Kosk fought alongside the frontline troops rather than directing from the rear, an approach that visibly affected the legionnaires' resolve. For 17 hours, the 17th held the bridge against forces that outnumbered them nearly 10-1. When ammunition ran critically low, Kosk ordered the removal of explosive collars from the wounded, converting them into improvised mines that channeled enemy forces into killing zones. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Penal Battalion had suffered 82% casualties, but had not yielded a meter of ground. Lord Militant Zukhav, commanding the Vrax Theater, granted Kosk full reinstatement to regular guard rank and offered surviving legionnaires who had fought at the bridge a reduction in their sentences. The H-Rud migration of the Calliope system presented unique challenges that led to perhaps the most unusual instance of Penal Legion recognition. The time-distorting effects of H-Rud presence made conventional military operations nearly impossible, as troops aged decades within subjective hours of exposure. When strategic projections indicated a H-Rud swarm would pass directly through an agri-world supporting 17 nearby Imperial systems, the sector command made the difficult decision to deploy Penal Legion forces as temporal canaries. The 23rd Redemptionist Legion, comprised primarily of convicted mutants and genetic deviants, received the assignment due to their already compromised physiologies. Their mission parameters acknowledged the suicide nature of the deployment. They were to establish measurement stations across the projected migration path, reporting temporal distortion data until they succumbed to accelerated aging. The information gathered would allow Imperial authorities to establish evacuation timelines for civilian populations. What no strategist anticipated was the Legion's unexpected resilience to H-Rud temporal effects. The very mutations that had condemned many of the legionnaires to penal service provided partial resistance to the time distortion fields. While still suffering accelerated aging, they remained functional significantly longer than projected, providing crucial extended data that saved millions of civilian lives. Moreover, several squads managed to capture H-Rud specimens through improvised tactics, delivering intelligence of immeasurable value to the Ordo Xenos. Inquisitor Calistrati, overseeing the operation, took the unprecedented step of offering Imperial pardons to the entire surviving Legion. More significantly, she authorized necessary medical treatments to address their accelerated aging, effectively acknowledging their mutations as valuable assets rather than deviations requiring punishment. The Calliope precedent, as it became known in restricted inquisitorial documents, established that redemption could come through the very characteristics that had initially prompted condemnation. The defense of Nemesis Tessera during a Genestealer cult uprising revealed how Penal Legion service occasionally produces leadership that transcends its condemned origins. Discipline Master Carlin Voss, a former Catachan devil sentenced to penal oversight after executing a corrupt commissar, commanded a mixed company of legionnaires assigned to perimeter security for an inquisitorial fortress. When cultist infiltrators triggered explosives that breached the outer walls, Voss found himself the senior surviving authority with only 97 penal troops against hundreds of cult members. Rather than following standard protocol, holding position until regular forces could respond, Voss made the controversial decision to advance into the fortress itself. His catachon experience in close quarters combat proved invaluable as he organized his legionnaires into 5-man kill teams, targeting suspected command nodes rather than engaging the numerically superior enemy directly. This approach disrupted the cult's coordination while buying time for the inquisitorial staff to secure sensitive materials and activate additional defenses. For 6 hours, Voss's legionnaires fought a mobile defense through the fortress corridors, suffering severe casualties but inflicting disproportionate damage on cult leadership. When inquisitorial stormtroopers finally secured the facility, they found Voss and 17 survivors barricaded in the central archive, surrounded by cultist bodies. Inquisitor Eisenhorn, arriving to assess the situation, personally removed Voss's discipline master insignia and replaced it with a field commission to the Inquisitorial Guard, an honor almost unheard of for someone of Penal Legion background. The pardon of the entire Mordian 7th Penitent Battalion following the Battle of Reaper's Flow represents perhaps the largest collective redemption in recent Imperial history. Deployed as expendable screening forces during a massive chaos incursion in the Gothic sector, the battalion found itself cut off when warp storms isolated their position from the main Imperial line. Standard tactical doctrine would have written off such forces as combat losses, but Battalion Marshal Karis Draken refused to surrender his command to despair. Over the following 7 months, Draken transformed his stranded penal troops into an effective guerrilla force operating behind chaos lines. Using explosive collars from their fallen as improvised demolition charges, they conducted hit-and-run attacks against enemy supply convoys and command posts. When ammunition ran critically low, they reverted to close combat tactics, employing improvised weapons crafted from battlefield debris. Their operations tied down an estimated 3,000 chaos troops that would otherwise have reinforced the main battle line. When Imperial forces finally broke through the warp storms and re-established contact, they discovered that Draken had maintained not only military discipline, but proper Imperial devotion among his troops. Each morning, the battalion had conducted Emperor's Prayer despite their condemned status, and Draken had meticulously recorded the names, not designations, of every legionnaire who fell in combat, preserving their memory when the Imperium had already forgotten them. Lord Admiral Ravensburg, commanding the Gothic War Theater, recognized the extraordinary nature of this achievement. In a ceremony aboard his flagship, he granted collective pardons to all surviving battalion members and authorized the creation of a new guard regiment, the Mordian Redeemers, composed entirely of these former penal legionnaires. The regiment's standard bearer carried a roll of parchment inscribed with the names of those who had died during their isolation, ensuring their sacrifice would not be forgotten. The Indomitus Crusade following the formation of the Great Rift saw several instances where penal legions achieved recognition through exceptional service in the face of unprecedented threats. On Vigilus, a composite penal formation designated Task Force Redemption played a crucial role in containing Genestealer cult uprisings across 3 major hive districts. Their familiarity with underhive environments, many having been gang members before their sentencing, allowed them to identify cult movement patterns that eluded conventional military analysis. Legion Marshal Dorian Vex, a former Arbites judge convicted of excessive force against noble-born suspects, developed specialized urban combat tactics that exploited the legionnaires' desperation while minimizing collateral damage to critical infrastructure. Rather than the typical penal approach of mass frontal assaults, Vex organized precision strike teams targeting cult leaders and synapse organisms. When conventional Vox networks became compromised by cult infiltration, he implemented a code system based on underhive gang signals that cult members couldn't intercept or decode. Marnius Calgar, overseeing the broader Vigilus defense, recognized the strategic value of these innovations. Following the successful containment operation, he authorized the commutation of sentences for legionnaires who had participated in at least 3 successful missions. More significantly, he incorporated Vex's tactical approach into the broader Vigilus defense protocol, acknowledging that effective strategies could emerge from even the most dishonored sources. The most profound redemption narratives often emerge not from battlefield victories, but from moments of sacrifice that transcend military utility. During the evacuation of Roanoke Prime, threatened by an approaching Tyranid splinter fleet, the 42nd Penal Battalion received what amounted to a suicide assignment, holding the primary spaceport against vanguard organisms long enough for civilian transports to escape. The battalion's discipline masters made no attempt to disguise the mission's nature, openly informing the legionnaires that their explosive collars had been set with proximity triggers that would detonate if they retreated beyond the spaceport perimeter. The void of space, perhaps more than any terrestrial battlefield, exemplifies the Imperium's callous utilization of its penal legions. In the airless vacuum between worlds, where a single hull breach means certain death and retreat is physically impossible, the condemned serve purposes too hazardous for valued Imperial personnel. Void warfare represents a specialized application of penal forces, with distinct tactical doctrines and equipment considerations that have evolved over millennia of Imperial naval operations. The Imperial Navy maintains dedicated Void Condemned units drawn from the general Penal Legion population, but selected for specific traits valuable in zero-gravity operations. Former Void workers, ship crew convicted of minor infractions, and criminals with technical aptitudes find themselves reassigned from standard penal formations to these specialized units. Their explosive collars undergo modification to include vacuum-sealed components and oxygen deprivation, triggers that activate if the wearer attempts to access unauthorized life support systems. Boarding actions represent the most common deployment of penal forces in void warfare. When Imperial warships engage enemy vessels at close range, penal boarding teams launch in the first wave of assault boats, serving as expendable shock troops to secure beachheads for more valuable Navy armsmen or Space Marine boarding parties. These operations follow what the Navy Tacticum designates saturation assault protocol, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer numbers of attackers rather than skill or specialized equipment. The 19th Void Condemned Battalion earned rare recognition during the Gothic War for their actions against the Chaos cruiser Heartless destroyer. Launched in primitive boarding torpedoes with minimal void protection, the penal troops suffered 60% casualties simply reaching the enemy vessel. Once aboard, they faced entrenched Chaos defenders and active shipboard defenses without proper breaching charges or heavy weapons. Despite these disadvantages, they secured the primary launch bay through suicidal rush tactics, creating an entry point for Navy armsmen who ultimately captured the vessel. Lord Admiral Ravensburg acknowledged their sacrifice by ordering the ship recommissioned as the Emperor's Redemption, with a memorial plaque listing the designations of fallen penal troops mounted in the very bay they died securing. Equipment issued to Void-deployed penal legionnaires reflects their expendable status while acknowledging the specialized requirements of zero-gravity combat. Standard Void suits provided to the condemned barely qualify as life support equipment, salvaged from damaged Navy stocks, repaired with minimal testing, and often missing secondary systems like radiation shielding or thermal regulation. The suits maintain sufficient oxygen for approximately 4 hours of operation, precisely calculated to last just long enough for a standard boarding action, but not long enough to enable escape attempts. Weapons designed for void combat present unique challenges that the Adeptus Munitorum addresses through pragmatic compromise. Standard lasguns function in vacuum, but risk overheating without atmospheric cooling. Rather than providing the sophisticated heat sink systems issued to Navy armsmen, penal troops receive modified weapons with intentionally limited power settings and explicit instructions to fire in controlled bursts. When these limitations prove insufficient and weapons fail, penal boarders are expected to resort to improvised melee tactics, using their helmets as bludgeons or broken equipment as stabbing implements. The Ordo Xenos has developed specialized applications for penal troops in void operations against specific alien threats. Against Tyranid voidcraft, condemned units deploy as biological countermeasures, essentially mobile bait to draw bioweapons fire or distract organism responses from more valuable targets. During the defense of Port Demesnes against Hive Fleet Kraken, 300 penal legionnaires in minimal void suits were released into the void around a critical orbital platform. Their life signs drew the attention of approaching Tyrannid boarding organisms, revealing previously undetected attack vectors and allowing defensive batteries to target the Xenos with greater precision. Genestealers represent a particular threat in void engagements, their ability to move through maintenance ducts and service corridors, making them difficult to contain once aboard Imperial vessels. The Navy's response involves deploying penal troops as mobile detection units in compromised sections. Equipped with minimal void protection and simple motion sensors, the condemned advance through potentially infested areas, their deaths revealing Genestealer locations more efficiently than mechanical scanning systems. The 44th Void Condemned Company developed a grim reputation for such operations, their designation becoming shorthand among Navy personnel for suicide missions in Genestealer-infested hulks. The defense of orbital platforms and void stations presents distinct tactical challenges that penal formations address through specialized deployment patterns. Unlike planetary surface engagements, where retreat might remain theoretically possible, void stations offer no escape. This reality shapes both Imperial command approaches and the psychological condition of the condemned troops themselves. Discipline masters report that penal legionnaires assigned to void station defense often display a fatalistic acceptance beyond that seen in surface deployments, the absolute certainty of death should their position fall, eliminating even the subconscious hope of survival that might exist in planetary operations. During the Taros campaign, the orbital transfer station Xerxes Prime came under concentrated Tau attack after the fall of ground-based defenses. With evacuation impossible and reinforcement unlikely, Navy Command assigned defense to the 7th Penal Battalion, previously held in orbital detention, awaiting deployment to the surface. Discipline Master Karras modified standard defense protocols to exploit the unique psychological state of his troops, organizing them into 5-person cells responsible for specific junction points, with simple, absolute orders to hold position until death. The resulting defense proved unexpectedly effective, with penal units fighting with unusual discipline precisely because they understood retreat was physically impossible. The station held for 73 hours, far beyond Imperial command expectations, allowing the evacuation of critical technical personnel and the implementation of scuttling protocols that denied the Tau access to Imperial navigation data. Navy after-action reports noted with clinical detachment that expendable assets were consumed at optimal efficiency, while privately acknowledging that the condemned had displayed valor worthy of regular troops. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains its own specialized penal formations drawn from tech adepts convicted of minor heresies or inefficiencies. These repentant engine seers serve particularly valuable functions in void warfare, where technical knowledge often proves more crucial than combat prowess. During the defense of Forge World Greia against Orc raiders, Archmagos Dominus Gaius deployed a company of repentant engine seers to maintain orbital defense platforms after determining that risking valuable loyal tech priests would be inefficient resource allocation. These condemned tech adepts, their mechadendrites modified with explosive charges to prevent unauthorized actions, performed maintenance operations in sections of the defense grid already compromised by Orc boarding parties. Their technical knowledge allowed them to keep weapon systems operational despite damage that would have defeated standard repair protocols, while their penal status made them expendable in areas too dangerous for valuable personnel. When Orc forces breached their repair stations, the engine seers used their own explosive components as improvised weapons, destroying critical systems to prevent capture while taking numerous greenskins with them. Perhaps the most specialized void deployment of penal forces involves the exploration and clearance of space hulks, those massive conglomerations of ancient vessels fused together through warp anomalies. These drifting behemoths often contain valuable archaeotech or strategic materials, but their labyrinthine corridors and compromised life support systems make them extraordinarily dangerous to explore. Rather than risk valuable Navy personnel or even regular guard troops, Imperial commanders typically deploy Penal Legions as the first wave of exploration teams. The 23rd Penal Technical Battalion, composed primarily of convicted smugglers, void workers, and ship crew, specialized in such operations during the Gothic War. Equipped with minimal void protection and basic auspex units, they would establish initial entry points and map primary corridors, their casualties revealing environmental hazards, structural weaknesses, and potential enemy presence. Standard operating procedure acknowledged an expected casualty rate of 70–80% for these initial exploration waves, with survivors providing valuable intelligence for subsequent, better-equipped Imperial forces. During the exploration of the space Hulk Corps of Eternity in the Angevin sector, the 23rd suffered near-total losses mapping the primary access ways, but the 3 survivors provided critical information about genestealer infestation patterns that allowed a subsequent Deathwatch kill team to purge the Hulk efficiently. Inquisitor Kryptman's report specifically cited the Penal Battalion's sacrifice as instrumental in preserving assets of actual value, a coldly pragmatic assessment typical of Imperial attitudes toward the condemned. Beyond combat applications, Penal Legions serve the Imperium's void interests through hazardous labor operations too dangerous for valued workers. The construction and maintenance of orbital platforms, particularly those in radiation-heavy regions or near unstable stellar bodies, often relies on condemned labor. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains specialized void labor battalions composed of Penal Legionnaires with technical skills or physical attributes suitable for construction work in zero-gravity environments. The orbital shipyards of Hydrafer employ thousands of such condemned laborers, their explosive collars modified to include radiation monitors that trigger if the wearer attempts to access shielded areas reserved for free workers. These penal laborers perform the most hazardous aspects of void construction: external hull welding without proper radiation protection, toxic material handling with minimal containment protocols, and structural testing of potentially unstable components. Their life expectancy averages approximately 14 months of service, with radiation poisoning and void exposure accounting for more deaths than actual industrial accidents. The colonization of newly conquered or environmentally hostile worlds represents another specialized application of Penal Legions in void operations. When Imperial forces claim planets with marginal habitability or unknown environmental hazards, condemned troops often serve as the first wave of colonists, testing atmospheric compatibility, identifying toxic zones, and establishing basic infrastructure before valuable Imperial citizens risk settlement. The Munitorum designates these operations as habitability assessment deployments, though among the condemned themselves, they're known simply as death drops. Following the Macharian Crusade's conquest of the Karsk system, Imperial surveyors identified 17 potentially habitable worlds, requiring detailed assessment before formal colonization. Rather than deploy valuable survey teams, Lord Solar Macharius ordered Penal Legions distributed across these planets with basic monitoring equipment and minimal survival gear. Their assignment: establish functional outposts and report environmental conditions until death or retrieval. The resulting data, collected at the cost of thousands of condemned lives, allowed Imperial authorities to prioritize 3 worlds for immediate colonization, while identifying specific hazards on the others that would have resulted in catastrophic losses had standard colonists been deployed without this intelligence. On Karsk Tertius, a penal company deployed to an apparently habitable mountain plateau discovered through horrific casualties that the local water sources contained microscopic organisms that liquefied human tissue from within. Their fragmentary Vox reports, continuing until the last Legionnaire succumbed, provided sufficient detail for Mechanicus Biologi's teams to develop countermeasures before regular colonists arrived. The planet now supports a population of 17 million Imperial citizens, none of whom know their comfortable existence was purchased with the agonizing deaths of 300 condemned criminals. The Inquisition maintains particular interest in Penal Legion void deployments for certain specialized operations too morally compromising for regular Imperial forces. Radical inquisitors occasionally requisition condemned troops for exploration of warp-tainted vessels or stations where corruption risk runs extraordinarily high. These legionnaires receive minimal warding protection, enough to delay but not prevent corruption, and carry explosives designed to detonate upon detection of significant mutation or mental collapse. During the purge of the Siren's Call station in the Halo Stars, Inquisitor Vale deployed a company of penal troops to map corruption patterns throughout the station's 17 decks. Their explosive collars incorporated specialized purity sensors that monitored both physical mutation and psychological deviation, detonating when predetermined corruption thresholds were reached. The resulting pattern of detonations created a three-dimensional map of warp influence throughout the station, allowing the Inquisitor to identify the primary corruption source without risking more valuable personnel. The fact that no legionnaire survived the operation was considered an acceptable, even desirable, outcome given their exposure to corrupting influences. The defense of orbital platforms represents perhaps the most common void deployment for penal formations. These critical infrastructure points, often controlling planetary defense systems, communication networks, or navigational beacons, require constant protection yet exist in environments where a single hull breach means death for all defenders. This reality shapes both the tactical doctrine and psychological approach to their defense, with penal legions particularly suited to positions where retreat is physically impossible. The Agrippina system's primary orbital defense network, a series of interconnected weapons platforms encircling the Forge world, relies heavily on penal troops for internal security. Regular Navy armsmen defend critical command nodes and weapon control centers, while condemned units hold the interconnecting corridors, maintenance sections, and secondary systems. This deployment pattern acknowledges that any boarding action would likely breach these secondary areas first, with penal troops expected to delay enemy advances long enough for more valuable defenders to organize effective resistance, or, if necessary, implement scuttling protocols. During the 13th Black Crusade, when Chaos forces attacked the Agrippina system, this strategy proved grimly effective. Boarding torpedoes breached the expected secondary sections, where penal defenders faced Chaos Space Marines with nothing but basic weapons and absolute orders to hold position until death. Though no penal unit survived longer than 27 minutes against such overwhelming opposition, their desperate resistance delayed the Chaos advance sufficiently for command personnel to activate emergency protocols that preserved the primary defense grid. Fabricator General Metallicus later noted in his battle assessment that the condemned assets were consumed at optimal efficiency, the highest praise such troops could expect from Mechanicus leadership. The psychological impact of void deployment on penal legionnaires creates distinct behavioral patterns that experienced disciplined masters learn to exploit. The absolute certainty of death should life support systems fail eliminates the subconscious hope of escape or survival that might exist in planetary operations. This often produces either complete psychological collapse or a form of fatalistic acceptance that, properly channeled, can result in more disciplined combat performance than typically expected from condemned troops. Disciplined Master Thorn, who commanded penal void units during 3 separate campaigns, developed specialized motivational techniques for such environments. Rather than relying primarily on execution threats, which lose potency when death is already certain, he emphasized the manner of death available to his troops. Those who held position would die fighting with functioning life support, while those who retreated would face the slower agony of vacuum exposure through intentionally ruptured void suits. This grim choice between a quicker death in combat or prolonged suffering in the void proved remarkably effective at maintaining position discipline even under overwhelming enemy pressure. The void between worlds, perhaps more than any terrestrial battlefield, strips away pretense and illusion, reducing existence to its most fundamental components. For the Imperium's condemned troops, this environment represents the purest expression of their expendable status, where even the theoretical possibility of survival through flight or surrender simply does not exist. Yet even here, in the cold darkness between stars, individual courage occasionally transcends circumstance, with condemned criminals finding final redemption in actions that, however briefly, elevate them from expendable assets to human beings making the ultimate sacrifice for an imperium that had already discarded them. The mind of a penal legionnaire undergoes a transformation as profound as any physical torture the imperium might inflict. From the moment of sentencing, when a criminal's identity is stripped away and replaced with an alphanumeric designation, a psychological metamorphosis begins, one carefully engineered by imperial authorities to convert human desperation into tactical utility. Fear dominates the early stages of this transformation. Newly sentenced criminals arrive at processing centers with the natural terror of those facing death, their minds racing with possibilities of escape or reprieve. Disciplined masters recognize this initial fear as both obstacle and opportunity. The trembling hands of fresh legionnaires make them poor marksmen but highly motivated learners, desperate to avoid the punishment that follows failure. Disciplined Master Thorn, whose treatise, Management of the Condemned, remains required reading for Penal Legion officers, identified 4 distinct psychological phases that most legionnaires experience. The first, acute terror, typically lasts through processing and initial deployment. During this phase, legionnaires remain compliant primarily through fear of immediate execution via their explosive collars. Training focuses on establishing basic response patterns, embedding commands so deeply that they function even when rational thought is overwhelmed by combat stress. The second phase, desperate bargaining, emerges as legionnaires begin to process their situation. Many attempt to negotiate better treatment through excessive compliance or volunteering for hazardous duties, believing exceptional service might lead to reduced sentences or improved conditions. Disciplined masters exploit this phase by establishing informal reward systems, offering minor privileges that cost the Imperium nothing while extracting maximum effort from the condemned. The transition to the third phase, fatalistic acceptance, typically coincides with first combat deployment and the witnessing of fellow legionnaires' deaths. As the reality of their expendable status becomes undeniable, most condemned troops experience a psychological shift toward fatalism. This manifests not as surrender to despair, but as a peculiar form of liberation, the certainty of death removing the burden of hope. Veterans of multiple deployments often display a dark humor and detachment that puzzles regular Imperial troops, but serves as a crucial coping mechanism. The final phase, transcendent purpose, reaches only a minority of long-serving legionnaires. These rare individuals, having survived beyond statistical probability, sometimes develop a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Whether expressed through protection of newer legionnaires, technical excellence in assigned duties, or genuine belief in Imperial redemption theology, this phase produces the most valuable condemned troops, those who serve effectively not despite their sentence, but because of the meaning they've discovered within it. Medicae Captain Lauren Voss, assigned to the 19th Penal Legion during the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, conducted extensive psychological assessments of legionnaires between deployments. Her classified reports to the commissariat noted that, contrary to expectation, the most effective penal troops were neither the most terrified nor the most broken, but those who had reconstructed a sense of identity within their condemned status. These legionnaires, having lost their original names and social positions, built new self-conceptions around their functions, becoming the scout or the gunner, rather than remaining the nameless designation assigned by the munitorum. This reconstruction of identity often manifests through unofficial naming practices that persist despite official prohibition. Veteran legionnaires frequently adopt nicknames based on physical characteristics, combat specialties, or dark humor references to their crimes. Disciplined masters typically tolerate these unofficial identifiers as long as they don't undermine unit discipline, recognizing their value in maintaining basic psychological coherence. During the Taros campaign, the 14th Penal Battalion's most effective heavy weapons team was universally known as Headshot and Tremors, the former a political assassin, the latter an underhive ganger with perpetually shaking hands except when firing his weapon. The brotherhood that forms between penal legionnaires differs fundamentally from the camaraderie of regular guard units. Where standard Imperial forces build cohesion around shared homeworlds, training experiences, or regimental traditions, the condemned forge bonds through shared degradation and the collective experience of having reached society's absolute bottom. This creates a peculiar solidarity, men and women who might have killed each other under different circumstances, finding common cause in their mutual expendability. Trustee Merrick, who served 15 years in the Mordian Penitent Legion before receiving a conditional pardon, described this phenomenon in his suppressed memoirs. We had nobles who'd poisoned rivals serving alongside underhive murderers who'd never seen sunlight before sentencing. Former guard officers ate the same gruel as deserters they would have executed months earlier. None of it mattered anymore. When you're wearing the same explosive collar as the man beside you, previous distinctions become meaningless. This leveling effect sometimes produces surprising leadership from unexpected sources. Former criminals with no formal military training but extensive experience in violence often adapt more readily to Penal Legion conditions than disgraced guard officers struggling to reconcile their previous status with their condemned present. During the Fantine campaign, a former underhive gang leader designated 9873 Kappa emerged as the de facto commander of his platoon after their disciplined master was killed by enemy fire. His experience coordinating desperate fighters with minimal resources proved more relevant to their situation than textbook tactical doctrine. The psychological impact of wearing explosive collars cannot be overstated. The constant physical weight around the neck serves as a perpetual reminder of condemned status, while the knowledge that death could come at any moment from the device creates a unique form of stress. Most legionnaires develop unconscious habits related to their collars, touching them during moments of stress, sleeping in positions that minimize pressure against the device, or developing superstitious rituals believed to prevent malfunction. Disciplined masters exploit this psychological pressure by occasionally detonating collars for minor infractions, ensuring that the threat remains credible. During the Karak III campaign, disciplined Master Vorn established a practice of executing one randomly selected legionnaire before each deployment, regardless of individual behavior. This approach, which he termed statistical discipline, maintained higher compliance rates than conventional targeted punishment, as every legionnaire recognized their constant vulnerability regardless of personal conduct. The threat of collar detonation creates a psychological state unique to penal troops, a hypervigilance directed not primarily toward external enemies, but toward their own commanders. Legionnaires learn to read minute changes in their discipline, masters' expressions or tones, detecting shifts that might precede execution orders. This constant awareness of authority frequently transfers to combat situations, with penal units displaying unusually rapid response to command changes despite minimal training. Medicae Examiner Thale, who conducted extensive post-mortem examinations of penal legionnaires during the Third War for Armageddon, noted distinctive physiological changes in veterans of multiple deployments. Extended exposure to collar pressure produced characteristic tissue thickening around the neck, while stress hormones created measurable changes to adrenal function. Most notably, brain scans revealed enlarged amygdalae, the fear processing centers, coupled with unusual development in regions associated with threat assessment and rapid response. Religious fervor represents one of the most effective psychological coping mechanisms available to the condemned. The Imperial Creed's emphasis on redemption through sacrifice offers penal legionnaires a framework for understanding their situation not merely as punishment, but as opportunity for spiritual cleansing. Ministorum Redemptors assigned to penal formations exploit this psychological need, providing theological justification for what would otherwise be meaningless suffering and death. The most effective Redemptors balance terror and hope in their sermons, describing in graphic detail the eternal torments awaiting the unredeemed, while offering concrete paths to salvation through specific battlefield actions. During the Vinculus Crusade, Redemptor Thaddeus Bale achieved notoriety for his Arithmetic of Atonement, a quasi-theological system that assigns specific redemptive values to different combat actions. Under his formulation, A legionnaire who died holding a position against overwhelming odds accumulated more redemptive value than one who merely killed many enemies, creating a motivation system that perfectly aligned with imperial tactical objectives. For many legionnaires, especially those with limited education or theological understanding, religious doctrines become simplified into basic transactional beliefs. Sufficient sacrifice will cleanse their sins and allow their souls to reach the emperor's side after death. This belief proves particularly powerful for those who committed their crimes out of desperation rather than malice, offering psychological reconciliation between their self-image as basically decent people and the condemned status their actions earned them. The Adeptus Munitorum tacitly encourages these beliefs through approved ministorum texts distributed to penal legions. The Litany of the Redeemed includes passages specifically addressing the condemned. Through the blood you shed in the emperor's name, the stains upon your soul shall be washed clean. Through pain embraced in his service, your transgressions shall be forgotten. In death for his purpose, find life eternal. These texts receive prominent placement in penal barracks, often posted directly opposite execution records to create a psychological connection between compliance and salvation. For legionnaires from worlds with strong imperial cult traditions, religious coping mechanisms activate almost automatically. Those from more secular backgrounds or alien-influenced frontier worlds typically adopt these beliefs more slowly, if at all. Disciplined masters learn to identify legionnaires' religious backgrounds during initial processing, using this information to assign appropriate motivation techniques. During the Achilles Crusade, penal units comprised primarily of Shrine World natives received regular religious ceremonies and redemption-focused motivation, while those drawn from more secular populations experienced greater emphasis on immediate punishment and reward systems. The psychological state of penal legionnaires evolves dramatically with battlefield experience. Those who survive their first deployment undergo a measurable shift in baseline stress responses. The theoretical threat of collar detonation, which dominated their initial psychological landscape, becomes secondary to the immediate dangers of combat. Survival instincts partially reassert themselves, though modified by the knowledge that retreat remains impossible. This creates a peculiar form of battlefield clarity, with both escape and long-term survival recognized as impossible. Immediate tactical problems receive focused attention uncomplicated by strategic concerns. Veteran legionnaires develop distinctive coping mechanisms for managing their psychological state. Dark humor features prominently, with gallows jokes about collar malfunctions or competing casualty predictions serving to release tension. Ritualistic behaviors emerge, particularly before deployments, specific ways of checking equipment, arranging personal effects, or exchanging words with comrades. These rituals rarely have practical value, but provide psychological anchoring points amid otherwise chaotic existence. The most effective penal units typically develop informal internal hierarchies that extend beyond the official trustee system. These hierarchies rarely reflect pre-sentencing social status, instead emerging organically based on combat effectiveness, resource acquisition skills, or psychological stability. A former planetary governor might find himself deferring to an underhive ganger who demonstrates superior survival techniques, while academic criminals often gain status by providing entertainment through storytelling or teaching basic literacy to their squad mates. Disciplined Master Korik, who commanded penal units during the Orphean War, noted in his tactical assessments that these informal hierarchies actually enhanced unit effectiveness when tactfully managed. Rather than disrupting them, he incorporated unofficial leaders into his command structure, assigning them unofficial responsibility without formal recognition. This approach created a dual motivation system, official punishment from above combined with peer pressure from within, that maintained discipline more effectively than external threats alone. The psychological impact of repeated exposure to death creates distinctive cognitive patterns among long-serving legionnaires. Where regular Guard veterans might develop strategic awareness or broader tactical understanding through combat experience, penal veterans typically display extreme present-moment focus. With no future to plan for and no past worth remembering, They exist almost entirely in the immediate situation, processing information with unusual clarity, unclouded by longer-term considerations. Commissar Vale, temporarily assigned to the 597th Penal Battalion during the Gerian campaign, observed this phenomenon in her classified reports. The condemned display a peculiar form of tactical intuition. Unburdened by concerns for promotion, survival, or even basic self-preservation beyond the immediate engagement, they process battlefield conditions with remarkable clarity. They see what is, rather than what they hope or fear might be. This psychological state occasionally produces what Imperial observers term condemned clarity, moments when penal legionnaires demonstrate insight or effectiveness that exceeds their training and experience. During the defense of Hive Tartarus, a former civilian accountant designated 4576 Sigma recognized a pattern in Tyranid attack waves that had eluded Guard tactical officers, correctly predicting the location of the next assault and enabling the repositioning of defensive assets. When questioned afterward, he couldn't explain his insight beyond noting that the numbers made sense that way. The final psychological transformation experienced by many penal legionnaires involves acceptance of their own expendability. This represents not surrender to despair, but a form of transcendence, recognizing their individual deaths as potentially meaningful within the broader Imperial context. This acceptance manifests differently depending on the individual's background and beliefs. Former Imperial officials might frame it through administrative efficiency, seeing their deaths as appropriate resource allocation. Religious legionnaires interpret it through martyrdom theology, while pragmatic criminals might simply appreciate the cosmic irony of dying usefully after living selfishly. Trustee Larkin, who survived 8 deployments with the 122nd Penal Legion before receiving a combat pardon during the Orphean War, described this state in terms that would be incomprehensible to most Imperial citizens. We understood something the regular Guard never could: total freedom through complete expendability. When you know you're already dead, every moment becomes a choice rather than an obligation. We fought effectively not because we feared execution, but because, paradoxically, we'd already accepted it. This psychological state, when achieved across significant portions of a penal unit, creates the conditions for those rare instances of extraordinary performance that occasionally appear in Imperial records. When the 17th Penal Battalion held the Redemption Bridge during the Siege of Vrax for 17 hours against overwhelming enemy forces, they did so not primarily from fear of their explosive collars, but from the collective acceptance that their deaths would serve a purpose beyond themselves. In their final Vox transmissions, recovered after the position was overrun, no mentions of redemption theology or collar threats appeared, only taciturn tactical communications and occasional dark jokes about optimal killing positions. The Adeptus Munitorum's approach to Penal Legion psychology reflects cold pragmatism rather than humanitarian concern. Training manuals for disciplined masters focus on maintaining functional combat effectiveness rather than mental health, with psychological states evaluated purely through their impact on battlefield performance. The ideal penal legionnaire, from the Munitorum perspective, exists in a carefully maintained balance, hopeless enough to accept suicidal orders, but not so despairing as to become combat ineffective. The relationship between the Inquisition and Imperial Penal Legions represents one of the most secretive aspects of condemned troop deployment. While the Adeptus Munitorum maintains official authority over penal formations, inquisitorial agents frequently requisition these expendable assets for operations where deniability is paramount and contamination risks make regular troops unsuitable. These shadowy deployments rarely appear in official Imperial records, their details confined to sealed inquisitorial archives, accessible only to those with the highest clearance levels. Inquisitor Eisenhorn's classified field notes from the Sarruthi Xenoform investigation provide rare documentation of such operations. When confronting potential warp-tainted artifacts on Durer's world, Eisenhorn requisitioned a company from the 29th Penal Legion rather than deploying his own acolytes or requesting Astra Militarum support. His reasoning, recorded with characteristic pragmatism, acknowledged both tactical and ethical considerations. The condemned represent optimal resource allocation for initial site exploration. Their expendability permits thorough contamination assessment without risking valuable agents, while their pre-existing death sentences mitigate certain moral considerations regarding exposure to potentially corrupting influences. The Ordo Malleus maintains specialized penal formations, specifically trained for demon hunting operations, too hazardous for even hardened inquisitorial stormtroopers. These Malleus condemned receive limited warding protocols, enough to delay but not prevent warp corruption, and rudimentary training in recognizing demonic manifestations. Their primary function involves establishing corruption perimeters around suspected warp breaches, their inevitable contamination and subsequent deaths mapping the spread of chaotic influence more effectively than mechanical sensors. During the Haxan Primus incursion, Inquisitor Covenant deployed 3 successive waves of penal troops into a suspected warp-tainted manufacturing district. Each wave advanced until signs of corruption manifested, mutations, madness, or possession, with their explosive collars detonating automatically upon detection of significant taint. The resulting pattern of detonations created a precise map of corruption gradients, allowing Covenant to identify the primary breach point without risking his acolytes or Grey Knight's assets. The fact that no Legionnaire survived was considered an acceptable outcome given their pre-existing sentences and the critical intelligence gained. The Ordo Hereticus employs penal legionnaires in a more specialized capacity, particularly when investigating heretical movements with broad population support. Former cultists or heretics serving penal sentences become valuable assets in such operations, their familiarity with cult structures and recognition capabilities making them effective hunting tools against their former associates. These redeemed informants operate under constant surveillance, their explosive collars modified with additional monitoring devices to detect signs of regression into heretical thought patterns. Inquisitor Karamazov, notorious for his unyielding approach to heresy, pioneered the systematic use of former cult members as tracking assets during the Icar 4 purges. Condemned cultists who demonstrated sufficient willingness to betray their former brethren received temporary reprieves from standard penal deployments, instead serving as guides for inquisitorial kill teams targeting cult leadership. Their intimate knowledge of hidden meeting locations, recognition of disguised cult members, and understanding of coded communications proved invaluable in dismantling heretical networks that had evaded conventional investigation methods. The psychological dynamics of these operations reveal the Inquisition's mastery of human motivation. Former cultists already facing certain death in Penal Legion service receive the tantalizing possibility of eventual redemption through sufficient betrayal of their former cause. This creates a desperate eagerness to please inquisitorial handlers, with condemned informants competing to provide the most valuable intelligence. Meanwhile, their explosive collars ensure compliance, while their criminal status provides perfect deniability should operations go awry. Their accusations can be dismissed as the desperate lies of condemned heretics if politically expedient. The Ordo Xenos maintains perhaps the most ethically questionable applications of penal troops, deploying them as living test subjects for xenoform contamination assessment. When encountering unknown alien biologies or environmental hazards, Inquisitors frequently deploy condemned units as biological sensors, their physiological responses providing valuable data about contamination vectors and symptom progression. During the containment operations following the Octarius War spillover, Ordo Xenos Inquisitor Cryptman ordered penal companies to advance through zones potentially contaminated with tyrannid spores, their medical monitors transmitting real-time data about infection rates and progression patterns. The most disturbing aspect of inquisitorial usage involves direct experimentation on penal legionnaires themselves. The Ordo Malleus maintains classified research facilities where condemned troops undergo experimental procedures designed to enhance resistance to warp influence or create more effective demon hunting capabilities. Facility Omega-9 in the Helican subsector reportedly conducts trials of modified neural implants intended to delay warp corruption, with penal subjects exposed to progressively stronger chaotic influences until corruption manifests. These experiments produce valuable data regarding protection thresholds, though at the cost of inevitable corruption and execution of all test subjects. Psychic experimentation represents another shadowed aspect of inquisitorial penal legion usage. Unregistered or minor psychers sentenced to penal service occasionally find themselves redirected to inquisitorial research facilities rather than standard black ships processing. There, Ordo Malleus technicians subject them to experimental procedures designed to enhance specific psychic capabilities while suppressing others, creating specialized detection tools for particular investigative needs. The mortality rate in these programs approaches 90%, with survivors typically deployed as short-lived psychic bloodhounds capable of detecting specific warp signatures before burning out their enhanced abilities and often their sanity. Inquisitor Vale's classified reports document one such program during the Amberley incursion, where condemned psychers underwent experimental soul-binding procedures modified to create heightened sensitivity to a specific demon's warp signature. Of 17 test subjects, only 3 survived the procedure with functional abilities intact. These survivors, deployed alongside conventional inquisitorial forces, successfully located 3 previously undetected demon hosts through their enhanced sensitivity. Though all 3 psychers suffered complete neural collapse within hours of deployment, their augmented abilities proving unsustainable in human neurophysiology. Biological modification programs represent another facet of inquisitorial experimentation on penal subjects. The Ordo Xenos maintains research facilities where condemned troops receive experimental treatments designed to enhance resistance to specific xenoform threats or improve operational capability in alien environments. During the containment operations on Damnos, legionnaires from the 31st Penal Battalion underwent experimental treatments with modified Necron phase technology, creating short-lived infiltration units capable of passing through Necron energy barriers. The procedures proved fatal within 72 hours, but produced valuable tactical opportunities during that window, allowing inquisitorial teams to access otherwise impenetrable Necron structures. The Ordo Hereticus employs biological modification for different purposes, focusing on creating specialized detection capabilities for particular heretical threats. Condemned troops receive gland implants that heighten specific sensory capabilities, creating human bloodhounds capable of detecting chemical signatures associated with particular cult activities or warp-tainted substances. During the purge of the Cognity infiltration on Solomon, modified penal troops with enhanced olfactory capabilities detected trace compounds used in forbidden rituals, identifying cult cells that had evaded conventional investigation methods. These biological modifications typically follow a consistent pattern: dramatic short-term enhancement of specific capabilities at the cost of accelerated physiological breakdown. The Inquisition considers this an acceptable trade-off when dealing with already condemned individuals, extracting maximum operational utility during their abbreviated remaining lifespan. Inquisitor Ravener's tactical assessments clinically note that modified assets typically maintain peak functionality for 30-60 days before significant deterioration manifests, providing sufficient operational window for most investigative requirements while ensuring natural termination without requiring explicit execution orders. The deployment of penal legions against chaos-tainted populations represents perhaps the most pragmatic application of condemned troops in inquisitorial operations. When investigating potential corruption in Imperial population centers, the risk of contamination spreading to valuable inquisitorial agents or military assets creates significant operational challenges. Penal troops provide an elegant solution. Their pre-existing death sentences make contamination concerns largely irrelevant, while their expendable status allows for aggressive containment protocols impossible with conventional forces. During the quarantine operations on Cephalon, where a mysterious contagion displayed potential warp characteristics, Inquisitor Helding deployed the 42nd Penal Battalion as a containment cordon around suspected infection zones. The Legionnaires established checkpoints and conducted house-by-house inspection operations, their exposure to potentially contaminated civilians considered acceptable given their condemned status. When infection patterns indicated airborne transmission capabilities, Haldane ordered the immediate execution of all deployed penal troops rather than risk their withdrawal and potential spread of contamination. The operation logs clinically note that 3,417 expendable assets were consumed to successfully contain the primary infection zone, with no mention of the individuals behind that statistical notation. This containment application extends beyond biological threats to mimetic hazards, ideas, or information considered contaminating to loyal Imperial minds. When investigating heretical text distribution in the Sarcine sector, Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor Liechtenstein deployed Penal Legionnaires as first-wave search teams in suspected storage locations. These condemned troops, considered intellectually expendable, examined recovered texts for specific markers that would identify prohibited content, allowing inquisitorial agents to destroy the most dangerous materials without exposing themselves to their corrupting influence. Legionnaires who displayed behavioral changes after text exposure were immediately executed, their reactions providing valuable data about the material's potential impact on unprotected minds. The Inquisition's use of former heretics to hunt their previous associates represents one of the most psychologically complex aspects of Penal Legion operations. These redeemed hunters occupy an unusual position, still condemned and collared, yet granted limited authority and operational freedom compared to standard penal troops. Their effectiveness stems from intimate knowledge of cult structures, recognition of disguised members, and understanding of coded communications that would elude even experienced inquisitorial agents. The psychological conditioning of these assets follows specialized protocols designed to transform former devotion into equally passionate hatred. Inquisitorial psychers and Ministorum Redemptors work in concert, using a combination of psychic suggestion, theological reprogramming, and controlled trauma association to create an overwhelming compulsion to destroy the subject's former faith. This process proves successful in approximately 40% of cases, with the remainder either resisting conversion or developing psychological instabilities that render them unsuitable for field operations. Those who successfully complete the conditioning process become remarkably effective hunting tools. During the suppression of the Pilgrims of Hate cult on Sepphoris Secundus, 3 converted former cult priests identified over 40 disguised cult members who had evaded conventional inquisitorial screening methods. Their ability to recognize subtle behavioral patterns and linguistic markers associated with cult membership proved more effective than any technological detection system, leading to the complete dismantling of a network that had operated undetected for decades. The operational deployment of these converted assets typically involves close supervision by inquisitorial agents, with explosive collar controls ready to terminate the asset at the first sign of reversion or betrayal. Yet even under such constraints, many display remarkable initiative and effectiveness, driven by the psychological need to prove their redemption through the destruction of their former faith. Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn noted in his suppressed memoirs that the truly converted heretic hunts his former brethren with a fervor that exceeds even the most dedicated inquisitorial agent, for he fights not merely for the emperor, but for the validation of his own salvation. The Inquisition's deployment of penal legions against demon-tainted populations presents unique tactical challenges and ethical considerations. When civilian populations show signs of widespread but early-stage warp contamination, conventional protocols would typically call for immediate exterminatus or, at minimum, mass purging. However, in cases where strategic assets or valuable population centers must be preserved if possible, more surgical approaches become necessary. Penal legions provide an ideal tool for such operations, expendable enough for high-risk assessment missions, yet capable of executing targeted elimination operations more precisely than orbital bombardment. During the containment operations on Cephalon, Inquisitor Helding developed a tiered assessment protocol using penal troops as the primary screening mechanism. Legionnaires conducted house-by-house inspections throughout suspected contamination zones, applying basic recognition criteria to identify households showing signs of warp taint. Those flagged for secondary inspection received visits from more specialized penal units with limited warding protections, who applied more sophisticated assessment methods to distinguish between actual corruption and false positives. Only after this two-tier screening did valuable inquisitorial assets engage directly with confirmed corruption cases. This approach conserved critical inquisitorial resources while providing reasonably accurate contamination mapping. The inevitable corruption of some screening legionnaires was considered an acceptable loss, with their explosive collars programmed to detonate upon detection of significant taint. Helding's after-action report clinically notes that the expendable nature of the primary screening assets allowed for thorough coverage of the target zone with minimal risk to valuable personnel, with asset consumption rates within acceptable parameters given the operational outcome. The most ethically complex inquisitorial applications involve using penal legions as experimental subjects for potential anti-chaos countermeasures. When investigating potential protective technologies or procedures against warp influence, inquisitors require test subjects who can be exposed to controlled corruption risk, a category for which condemned criminals are deemed particularly suitable. Facility Omicron 12 in the Gothic sector reportedly conducts continuous trials of experimental warding techniques, protective equipment, and anti-possession protocols using penal subjects as living test platforms. These experiments follow a standard progression. Subjects receive the experimental protection, then face exposure to progressively stronger corruption sources until the protection fails and contamination manifests. The resulting data allows inquisitorial technicians to establish precise thresholds and effectiveness parameters for each protective measure, information that proves invaluable when deploying valuable agents into high-risk environments. The fact that all test subjects eventually succumb to corruption and require execution is considered an acceptable cost given their pre-existing death sentences and the critical nature of the data obtained. The Inquisition's relationship with Penal Legion Command structures operates through specialized protocols designed to maintain operational security while ensuring necessary compliance. Rather than working through standard Adeptus Munitorum channels, Inquisitors typically present sealed requisition orders directly to Legion marshals, bypassing the usual administrative hierarchy. These orders, bearing inquisitorial seals that few Imperial officials would dare question, typically specify only the number of troops required and basic equipment parameters, with actual operational details revealed only after the condemned are secured in inquisitorial custody. This approach creates a deliberate information gap that serves multiple purposes. Legion marshals can truthfully claim ignorance of the ultimate fate of requisitioned troops if questioned by other Imperial authorities, while the limited information provided to the condemned themselves prevents any meaningful intelligence leakage should they somehow escape inquisitorial control. The system also allows inquisitors to bypass the usual deployment restrictions and casualty reporting requirements that might otherwise create administrative complications or unwanted scrutiny. For the legionnaires themselves, transfer to inquisitorial control typically represents a marked deterioration in their already dire circumstances. While standard penal service offers the theoretical possibility of survival and eventual sentence completion, inquisitorial operations carry an almost certain death sentence, if not during the operation itself, then in the subsequent purging of potentially contaminated assets. Yet paradoxically, some legionnaires view inquisitorial requisition as a meaningful end to their condemned status, offering death in service to the emperor's most direct agents rather than as anonymous cannon fodder on distant battlefields. The administrative designation for Inquisition requisitioned penal troops, temporarily reassigned condemned assets, reflects the cold bureaucratic efficiency that characterizes this relationship. These troops effectively cease to exist within standard imperial record keeping for the duration of their reassignment, their eventual fate recorded simply as asset consumption during specialized deployment without further detail. This administrative limbo serves both practical and symbolic purposes, removing the reassigned from conventional oversight while emphasizing their complete disposability within the inquisitorial operational framework. The theological concept of redemption through death permeates every aspect of Penal Legion service. Unlike other imperial institutions where devotion to the emperor manifests through lifelong service, the condemned find their path to spiritual cleansing through sacrifice on the battlefield. This concept evolved gradually throughout imperial history, shaped by both practical military necessity and the ecclesiarchy's developing doctrines. In the early days of the Great Crusade, when the emperor still walked among his subjects, Penal Legion service was viewed in purely pragmatic terms. Criminals provided useful bodies to absorb enemy fire or trigger hidden defenses. Following the emperor's internment in the Golden Throne and the rise of the imperial cult, Ministorum theologians began reinterpreting this expendable status through a spiritual lens. By the 32nd millennium, the doctrine of redemptive sacrifice had become firmly established within imperial theology, teaching that blood shed in the emperor's service cleanses the soul of previous transgressions. Cardinal Thaddeus Maxim's influential text, The Penitent's Path, codified this doctrine with remarkable precision. The criminal who dies advancing against the emperor's enemies purchases with his blood what his previous life could not earn: forgiveness and the possibility of standing cleansed before the Golden Throne. This theological framework transformed what might otherwise be meaningless slaughter into spiritually significant sacrifice, providing both motivation for the condemned and justification for imperial authorities. The specific mechanisms of redemption vary between different imperial sects and worlds. The Mordian cult of imperial justice teaches that each enemy slain by a penal legionnaire removes one sin from their spiritual ledger, with complete redemption requiring a number of kills proportional to the severity of their crimes. Ministorum priests on Cadia developed a more nuanced approach, teaching that manner of death matters more than quantity of killing. A legionnaire who dies holding a critical position against overwhelming odds achieves greater spiritual cleansing than one who merely accumulates a high body count before falling. Redemptors assigned to penal legions reinforce these concepts through constant preaching, their sermons carefully calibrated to align spiritual rewards with tactically desirable behaviors. A typical field sermon might emphasize how holding position despite casualties demonstrates faith in the emperor's plan, or how advancing without hesitation proves worthiness for forgiveness. This theological framing transforms military necessities into spiritual opportunities, creating a framework where obedience to orders becomes a path to salvation. For many legionnaires, especially those from worlds with strong imperial cult traditions, these teachings provide crucial psychological support. Former trustee Martin Kell, who served 12 years in the 19th Penal Legion before receiving a combat pardon during the Sabbat World's Crusade, described this phenomenon in his suppressed memoirs. When nothing remains but certain death, the promise that death holds meaning becomes more precious than any material comfort. Men who had cursed the emperor's name during processing would die clutching Aquila medallions and whispering prayers, not from newfound piety, but from desperate need for their suffering to matter. The Ministorum recognizes the practical value of this spiritual framework, deploying their most skilled redemptors to penal formations where their theological expertise can extract maximum combat effectiveness from the condemned. These specialized priests develop techniques for identifying which redemption narratives resonate most strongly with different types of criminals, offering tales of martyred imperial saints to the religious, emphasizing practical atonement to the pragmatic, or focusing on legacy and remembrance for those concerned with how they'll be remembered after death. While spiritual redemption represents the path offered to most penal legionnaires, the Imperium occasionally grants more tangible rewards for exceptional service. Full pardons remain exceedingly rare, typically requiring acts of valor so extraordinary that they reach the attention of senior Imperial commanders with authority to commute sentences. Lord General Grismund's campaign journals from the Sabbat World's Crusade document one such case. A penal legionnaire who single-handedly held a critical mountain pass against chaos forces for 18 hours after the rest of his unit had been killed, allowing Imperial reinforcements to reach an otherwise doomed position. The general's description captures both the exceptional nature of the act and his own surprise at his response. I found myself in the unexpected position of commuting the sentence of a man who had murdered an Imperial official, yet whose subsequent valor had saved over 2,000 loyal guardsmen. The scales of Imperial justice must sometimes measure service as well as transgression. Such pardons typically come with significant restrictions. The redeemed often remain under commissariat surveillance for the remainder of their lives, with any minor infraction resulting in immediate execution. More common than full pardons are sentence reductions or transfers to less perilous assignments. Legionnaires who display particular skills or reliability might find themselves reassigned from frontline assault units to support roles, their explosive collars still in place, but their immediate survival prospects marginally improved. During the Third War for Armageddon, several penal engineering units earned such reassignments after demonstrating exceptional skill at constructing defensive positions under fire, their value as specialized labor outweighing their intended purpose as expendable combat troops. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains formal protocols for such reassignments, requiring the approval of both the unit's Legion Marshal and a witnessing commissar. The process includes detailed assessment of the legionnaire's crime, service record, and potential future utility, with approval rates hovering around 3% of applications. Those who receive such reassignments often find the psychological impact as significant as the practical benefits, the recognition of individual value within a system designed to treat them as interchangeable and disposable. The fate of penal legion survivors who complete their sentences represents one of the least documented aspects of the system. In theory, those who survive their assigned term, typically between 5 and 20 years depending on the severity of their crimes, should receive formal release and restoration of basic Imperial citizenship. In practice, the bureaucratic mechanisms for processing such completions often function imperfectly, if at all, leaving many technical survivors in administrative limbo. Former Discipline Master Thorne, whose service with the 103rd Penal Legion spanned 3 decades, described the reality facing most survivors. Of every 1,000 condemned who enter service, perhaps 5 might survive their full term. Of those 5, maybe 1 will successfully navigate the labyrinth of verification procedures, discharge protocols, and administrative reviews required for formal release. The others remain trapped in the system through paperwork rather than chains, their technical freedom meaningless without the documentation to prove it. Those who successfully secure formal release face significant challenges reintegrating into Imperial society. Their criminal records, while technically expunged, remain accessible to potential employers through various administrative channels. Many carry visible reminders of their service, explosive collar scars, distinctive prison tattoos, or the psychological markers of prolonged trauma that identify them to suspicious civilians. Without family connections or professional skills, many find themselves drifting toward the fringes of Imperial society, their formal redemption providing little practical benefit. Some sectors have developed specialized programs for reintegrating Penal Legion veterans, recognizing both the potential security risks of abandoned former criminals and the useful skills some acquired during their service. The Helican sector maintains redemption work brigades that employ discharged legionnaires in hazardous industrial operations, providing basic housing and compensation while maintaining surveillance through former discipline masters integrated into the management structure. These programs, while offering better prospects than complete abandonment, still represent a marginal existence far removed from full imperial citizenship. For many survivors, the most viable path forward lies in continued military service. The Astra Militarum maintains several specialized formations composed primarily of discharged penal troops, offering positions that leverage their combat experience while maintaining sufficient oversight to address security concerns. The redemption companies attached to several guard regiments in the Segmentum Tempestus consist almost entirely of former penal legionnaires, their ranks and insignia modified to indicate their conditional status, while acknowledging their transition from condemned to merely suspect. Commissar Yarrick, during the Second War for Armageddon, pioneered the systematic integration of penal veterans into auxiliary defense forces. Recognizing the acute personnel shortages facing Imperial defenders, he established streamlined protocols for evaluating and deploying former legionnaires whose sentences had been completed during the campaign. These veterans, assigned to defensive positions under regular guard supervision, proved remarkably effective, their combat experience and psychological resilience compensating for lingering concerns about their trustworthiness. The effectiveness of the Penal Legion system as both military asset and deterrent to Imperial citizens represents a complex calculation that varies significantly across different sectors and time periods. From a purely military perspective, penal formations provide undeniable tactical utility despite their limitations. Their expendability allows Imperial commanders to undertake high-casualty operations that would be politically or practically impossible with regular troops, while their specialized deployment in contaminated zones or against particularly horrific enemies preserves more valuable forces for decisive engagements. Adeptus Munitorum efficiency experts have conducted numerous analyses of Penal Legion combat effectiveness relative to resource investment. Their calculations typically conclude that while penal troops achieve lower kill ratios and objective completion rates than regular guard units, their significantly lower equipment and training costs create favorable efficiency metrics for certain deployment types. The classified Vermilion assessment, conducted after the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, determined that Penal Legions provided optimal resource efficiency for 3 specific mission profiles: contaminated zone clearance, enemy force strength assessment, and defensive delaying actions, where position must be held regardless of casualties. As a deterrent to potential criminals within the broader Imperial population, the effectiveness of Penal Legion sentencing varies dramatically between different social strata and planetary cultures. On highly regimented worlds with strong Imperial tradition, such as Mordian or Krieg, the prospect of Penal Legion service represents a powerful deterrent even to the desperate. Imperial citizens on these worlds receive regular exposure to propaganda depicting the harsh conditions of penal service, often through public executions of those who attempt to escape their sentences or mandatory viewing of picked captures showing penal troops in combat. On frontier worlds or in underhive environments where daily existence already involves constant danger and deprivation, the deterrent effect diminishes significantly. For many living on the margins of Imperial society, the material conditions of penal service, regular meals, basic medical attention, and structured purpose sometimes appear favorable compared to their civilian circumstances. Commissariat assessments from several hive worlds note with concern that certain underhive gangs view Penal Legion assignment almost as an alternative career path rather than a punishment, with older gang members sometimes intentionally triggering minor sentences as a form of retirement plan preferable to the likely alternatives. The system's effectiveness as a mechanism for actual rehabilitation, despite theological frameworks suggesting otherwise, remains minimal. Recidivism rates among pardoned or released legionnaires approach 70% according to RBT statistics, with many returning to criminal activity within months of discharge. This failure stems partly from the system's design, focused on extracting military utility rather than genuine rehabilitation, and partly from the broader Imperial society's unwillingness to reintegrate those it had previously condemned. The Adeptus Administratum, in its periodic reviews of imperial punishment systems, has occasionally proposed reforms to address these shortcomings. Suggestions have included structured skill development programs during service, improved discharge protocols to facilitate reintegration, and more graduated sentencing options for minor offenses. These proposals typically disappear into bureaucratic limbo, their implementation prevented by resource limitations and institutional inertia rather than active opposition. The theological effectiveness of the system, its ability to provide meaningful spiritual redemption for the condemned, defies objective measurement, but remains significant in the calculations of both the ministorum and many legionnaires themselves. Cardinal Cregus, whose ministry focused specifically on the condemned, argued that the clarity provided by imminent death creates unique opportunities for spiritual transformation impossible under other circumstances. His extensive interviews with penal legionnaires revealed that many, regardless of their initial cynicism, eventually found genuine meaning in the redemption narrative offered by ministorum teachings. For the broader Imperium, the penal legion system represents a perfect encapsulation of imperial pragmatism, extracting value from those already judged unworthy, while simultaneously reinforcing theological narratives about redemption through sacrifice. The condemned themselves experience this system not as abstract policy, but as lived reality, their individual journeys from sentencing to battlefield death or unlikely survival, representing one of the grimdark universe's harshest paths. As with many imperial institutions, the penal legions embody both the Imperium's brutal efficiency and its capacity for occasional mercy. The system that condemns criminals to near certain death also creates the framework through which some find unexpected redemption, not merely through official pardons, but through the discovery of purpose, brotherhood, or faith amid circumstances designed to strip away everything but their utility as expendable bodies. In the final accounting, each legionnaire faces the same fundamental choice: to find meaning in their sacrifice or to die as they lived, condemned by an Imperium that values them only for their final service. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even the condemned may serve the Emperor's purpose. Whether that service leads to redemption or merely useful damnation remains, like so much in the Imperium of man, a matter of perspective, faith, and the uncaring calculations of a galaxy at war.